Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, some people say moving house can be as traumatic as getting a divorce or losing someone we love in a tragic accident. I thought that notion was preposterous, crazy even, until I experienced the pandemonium, chaos and upheaval of moving myself. We were young then, in our early 20s with our whole lives ahead of us. We were relocating from Boston to North Carolina. I thought it would be plain sailing, a smooth transition if you like, but it really wasn't. We were like laboratory rats, embarking on an untested experiment, as we had absolutely no idea where it would ultimately lead. Boston is indeed an expensive city with a small-town feel about it, a great place to raise a family, steeped in a rich, vibrant culture, on the cutting edge of medicine and technology, teeming with students from the university, as 1 out of every 8 people living there is a student. So the place exudes a youthful, flamboyant, vibrant energy, something that I always loved growing up. My husband and I had lived in Boston all our lives. It was a life we were familiar with, but sometimes stretching your wings to explore newer territory is well in order. If Christopher Columbus could circumnavigate the globe, then surely we could move only 12 hours away. It wasn't too far, nor was it a train smash. Of course, our parents on both sides of our family weren't at all happy about us intentionally abandoning Boston for pastures new and green. But with a little reasoning, they finally saw sense. Jamie and I thought it would be great to have a change of scene, an adventure if you like. My husband had been offered a fabulous, great surgical position at a local hospital, so off we went with the wind blowing in our hair, embarking on a whole new experience, allowing our whimsical naivety to easily overshadow any negative thoughts, fleeting doubts, or nonsensical misgivings that we might have actually had. We had already purchased our picturesque, idyllic, very well-appointed home, a delightful, beguiling dwelling in the heart of the rich, verdant countryside, with a fully stocked pond, a barn, a stables, a pretty double-storey farmhouse with a brown slate roof complemented by sandstone-coloured walls. It was a magnanimous wedding gift from my prodigal rich uncle, who was generously indulgent to a fault. "I don't want to leave you money in my will," he'd told us. "I want the privilege of seeing you spend it now, while I'm alive. Nothing would bring me greater joy to see you spend my money. It means that all my hard work that I put into investing has finally paid off, and I want to see it." We were fortunate enough to have that helping hand, or that flying start, so often welcomed in life, without the worries of crippling student debt or loans to suffocate us or drag us under like a powerful tsunami wave at sea. I acquaint student debt to the likes of a boa constrictor, squeezing you dry until you've got nothing left to give, only a few pennies left in your wallet. Luckily, we were not in that position, but my heart goes out to anyone who is. I remember standing in the open-plan living area of our brand-new home, being completely daunted by the amount of boxes that were scattered over the floor. My living area had become like a storeroom with hundreds of boxes piled on top of each other. I had no idea that we had so much stuff. I didn't know where to begin to start unpacking. I had willfully forgotten to label all the boxes. I knew the kettle was in one of them. The question was, which one of them? I was parched, longing for that first cup of coffee in my new home. It had been a long, grueling, drawn-out day that had drained me considerably, while the travelling had worn me to a frazzle. I began ferreting around in all the boxes when I finally found the kettle. A bottle of coffee granules along with some sugar, milk powder and mugs. I sighed with relief. At least I'd be able to have a much-deserved cup of coffee that I'd been dreaming about all day. That quintessential shot of caffeine that might be exactly what could reignite my wavering, rather flagging energy levels. If there was any light at the end of the tunnel, the fabulously elegant furniture we had ordered had luckily arrived. It had been placed around the home in all the wrong places by the delivery men. Typical. I can't say I was surprised at all. I mean, who in their right mind puts a writing desk in a toilet cubicle? Perhaps the delivery men thought someone would be writing their medical reports seated on the toilet seat, or sending emails via the toilet. Wonders never cease. The strange things people sometimes do always boggles the mind. So there was a lot to get done, a whole lot, and it would be up to me to organise the entire house, as my husband would be starting his brand new job on Monday morning. I knew that I was the one in charge of unpacking everything. I was not a good organiser at the very best of times, and wittingly putting the pressure on myself to get things done speedily, hunky-dory, as soon as possible. I was desirous for this enchanting house to start feeling like a home, my home, the rich embodiment and paragon of everything cosy, sumptuous, luxurious, welcoming and warm, so that we could settle down to enjoy our new lives. I was particularly looking forward to exploring, traversing the vibrant meadows, rolling green hills, the different wood groves on our property. I had visions of buying a few horses, a couple of ATVs, 2 hardy mountain bikes, so that Jamie and I could go rambling around the countryside at will. It would be fun, lots and lots of fun. I also fancied raising my own chickens, owning a couple of rambunctious, energetic farm dogs. They were a prerequisite. I was looking forward to it all. But right now I was beginning to feel overwhelmed and drained. The sight of all those boxes was becoming more and more intimidating, the kind of job I would much more likely procrastinate over, deliberately sidestepping, if you like, putting off, allowing the power of distraction to drag me away. I was rather good like that, the kind of person who handed my school essay in at the very, very last minute, having stayed up into the early hours of the morning to complete it. Then, of course, there was the negative side of this move. I had absolutely no friends in this part of the world, so I was bound to feel like a fish out of water for a while, before I began slowly but surely fitting into my new environment. It would be a whole lot easier for Jamie to make friends working at the hospital, but for me, the transition would be infinitely more challenging. I also knew I would miss all my friends back home in Boston. I reflected over this inevitability. A big nasty lump began to develop in the back of my throat. It was beginning to feel scratchy and dry, while a single lone tear glided down my pale cheek, which I quickly wiped away with my fingers. There was no point in getting all upset. I could hear my mother's voice ringing in my ears. "Sweetheart, why are you going to move so far away? Please stay here in Boston with us." I automatically cast away those pestering thoughts, swatting them away like a nagging mosquito, secretly scolding myself for allowing my angst to get the better of me. Now for that delicious piping hot cup of coffee, I thought, which is exactly what I needed to suppress or subdue the rising level of trepidation or sense of foreboding in my gut that was beginning to resurface like an unrelenting migraine headache, robbing me wantonly of any peace. I put the kettle on the gas hob. I began to make myself a much-needed cup of coffee. I was so grateful Jamie had gone into town to buy some local supplies to ensure we had something to eat for the next few days. I knew a bite to eat would certainly lift my mood. I hadn't eaten a thing all day. No wonder I was feeling so weak and wobbly. I was beginning to pour my coffee into a mug when I heard a raspy male voice say, "I'd love a cup of coffee too, if I may. 2 sugars." No milk, please." I looked up from the bright red kettle on the hob, with a startled, bewildered expression upon my face. There was a man standing in my kitchen. Wasn't it a bit presumptuous to just boldly and audaciously walk through my house, without even bothering to knock on the front door first, I thought, feeling ever so slightly piqued. Is that what the cheeky residents did here in North Carolina, I wondered? Just barge impudently into people's homes, insolently inviting themselves for coffee or afternoon chats at a whim. In Boston we were polite, civilized, respectful of people's privacy. We tended to meet people for coffee at a local cafe, but popping into someone's house unannounced, without some kind of advance warning, was not readily welcomed. Maybe here things were done differently. It did make me feel a wee bit awkward. What if I was caught by a neighbour in a compromising situation, such as wearing one of my green face packs that made me look exactly like a green tree python? That would be very embarrassing. As if reading my thoughts, the man shrugged his shoulders in a nonchalant way. "The front door. It was open. I did try to knock. I hope I did not startle you by trudging in like this." "Well, you kind of did. I wasn't expecting anyone to pop over like this on the spur of the moment." The man said nothing. I glanced up at him briefly. He didn't look local. He was wearing Levi jeans, a very ornate-looking buckle belt, along with a caramel-coloured cowboy hat. But his handsome, rather rugged face bequeathed an indigenous North American Indian appearance, as he possessed those typical wide almond-shaped eyes, the coarse dark hair, typical high cheekbones, a very pronounced, slightly bent nose. It was that genuine, authentic look that would have Universal Studios hiring him on the spot to play an Indian warrior. He looked the part. I wanted to ask him about his heritage, but I wasn't sure whether that was ethical to do so. You do have to mind your P's and Q's these days, in case people get offended. "The name is Unaga Wahuni," he said to me, taking the coffee from me, walking towards a brand new upholstered chair, still covered in plastic. "You don't mind if I sit here?" he asked. "Oh, go ahead," I said. "Sorry, it's still covered in plastic. It only arrived today." "I've sat on worse. My name is Cherokee, for White Owl," he said, "in case you were wondering." "I really like it," I said. "I thought you looked like you were from Cherokee lineage. I was afraid to ask, though. I'd rather call you White Owl, if you don't mind. Your Cherokee name is rather difficult to pronounce. My name is Bree, by the way, in case you were wondering." "Like the cheese?" said the Indian man, raising a quizzical brow. "I don't think in my culture we have gone so far as to name people after a soft cheese." "Like the cheese," I grinned, "but if I may add, it's an excellent cheese, even if I say so myself. Quite delicious, so soft and tender in the middle." "And you are soft and tender in the middle?" "Yes," I said, "I suppose I am." "Well, it's an acquired taste, I suppose," he teased. "You're probably wondering why I'm here," he said, stroking his chin awkwardly. "Well, I was, as a matter of fact. We've only just moved in. We don't know anyone in these parts. We're originally from Boston, you see." White Owl looked rather surprised. "You come from Boston? It's very different in this part of the world. Quite a radical change, if you don't mind my saying, from a university town to a country place like this. Moving to a new location is never easy," he said, looking at me with eyes that exuded a genuine warmth. "It takes adjustment, time, you know." I nodded. "You were saying why you're here?" I inquired curiously. "Ah, yes, about that. I'm here to warn you not to go cutting any of the trees on the east side of the valley. It's clearly marked as the Takama wood grove, so you'll know the precise grove of trees that I'm talking about. It's very important you don't forget this." He paused for a moment and continued. "Those trees belong to Takama, the wild man. If you upset him by cutting a tree down, you could end up falling victim to the Takama curse, which quite simply means that you might not wake up to embrace another day. I would hate to see that happen to you or anyone else for that matter. Anyone who attempts to cut down any of those trees on your account, they will be subject to the curse. It's not just pie in the sky. The curse is real. Legend has it that in the 1800s, the former landowner of your plot of land, a man called Hugh Davenport, had a young daughter called Charlotte. She was the apple of his eye, most particularly because he was unable to sire any other children after she was born. One day Charlotte was playing around the creek in the woodgrove there, and fell into the creek, nearly drowning as a result. But Tikama, the wild man, saved her life by rescuing her. I gather Hugh Davenport was so thrilled he named that woodgrove after Tikama, the wild man, giving him the woodgrove as well. And ever since then, even after his death, Tikama still protects his woodgrove of trees. I looked at White Owl as if he was speaking gibberish. "Sorry," I exclaimed, "but you're not making any sense, White Owl. You're saying I mustn't cut down any of those trees in the Tikama woodgrove because they belong to some random wild man. I don't mean to be rude, but that's crazy. We've just bought this property, I'll have you know. If we want to cut down some trees, it's our choice to make, not this Tikama character you're talking about. If you don't mind me saying, he's got some brass iron cheek telling us what we can and can't do on our property. If that's not bad enough, then trying to threaten us with a curse, well, that's ridiculous. I don't buy into any of this nonsense." White Owl did not seem ruffled nor offended by my indignant outburst. On the contrary, he looked like he'd anticipated my affronted, disgruntled reaction. I think he was all too well acquainted with the fact that non-Indigenous people like myself, to the Americas, rarely have no intrinsic understanding or comprehension of the world of spirits, ancient legends, curses or ghosts. We really are lacking in that area. He looked at me, his dark eyes seemed to register pity for my inability to understand what he was saying. "This land may be yours physically, Bree, but it's not yours spiritually. I need you to understand that. The east side of your land belonged to Tikama, who was once a great wild man in these parts, with an illustrious, formidable reputation, even among his own kind, who still revere him from beyond the grave. Even though he is long since dead, he is still the keeper of that forest of yours. Over the years, very strange things have happened on this property, when people have tried to cut down trees in the Tikama woodgrove, but they usually always end up dying. The former owner asked me to come and warn you about this, for the curse is real." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Well, when the owner first moved here, I warned her about the curse. Of course, like you, she was very cynical, didn't believe a word of it. She felt that the mature trees in the Tikama woodgrove needed thinning out, so she organised for a tree feller, along with his teammate, to start cutting down some of the trees. All of a sudden, before they even began to start, she saw the two tree fellers running away from the woods with distraught, hysterical faces, white with terror. They were completely unhinged, panicky, shaking so much they could barely get into their truck fast enough. They hightailed it out of her property as swiftly as they could. She was to learn later that both men claimed that while they began felling a tree, a smoky vapour rose from the ground. It whirled, twisted around itself until it became very solid. And that was when they saw the monstrous man of about 9 foot tall, covered in long, flowing dark hair, glaring at them with angry, bright red eyes. They described him as the most terrifying man that they'd ever seen. He began to unleash the most horrifying disembodied growl and proceeded to chase them out of the woods. The following day, both of those tree fellers were found lying deceased in their own beds, with the coroner unable to ascertain why they were dead, for the autopsy results yield no enlightening information, so both deaths were registered as unexplained. And this story is true? Is there a curse in the woodgrove? Why did the owner not warn us about it before we purchased this place? Because sometimes the secret goes with the land, from owner to owner. That's the way it goes, said White Owl, looking at me gravely. Nice coffee, by the way. When you buy the property, you receive the secret, not the other way around. Thanks, I said. So you're saying Takama, a wild man, curses people beyond the grave with a deadly accident if they dare to attempt to cut down the trees in the Takama woodgrove? That's about the nuts and bolts of it, said White Owl, looking at me with gentle eyes. Now Takama is not adverse to a dead tree being removed or new trees being planted in their place over generations. But what you need to know is that any new tree planted in the Takama Grove is considered his. It's not yours. What if we need to cut down a tree there? Supposing a tree requires removal, but it's not dead. What then? Ah, now that is a very good question, and one I'm happy to answer. You just have to ask Takama very, very nicely, like you do with anything in life. If you want something, you just ask. But it's not asking that is what is offensive to Takama. Well, how do we do that if he's dead? I asked, looking rather perturbed. You need to build a fire pit in the Takama woodgrove. Then in your mind you ask him if it's all right to cut the tree. If the answer is yes, then within 24 hours you will somehow receive an eagle's feather. Then you will know it is safe to remove that tree. This wild man, Takama, that you're talking about, it isn't a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch you're talking about, is it? I've watched all kinds of television programs about those things before. Is this wild man the same thing, or is he something completely different? The very same, said the Indian. I prefer to call them wild men, not Sasquatch or Bigfoot, for these things are not animals. No, in no way, shape or form. They are wild people of the woods, covered in hair, but they're misunderstood, misrepresented by your people, which causes contentious issues to arise. These wild men, like you, just want to exist in peace, but when they are provoked, they can become quite belligerent. Once White Owl had left my home, I started to regret that I hadn't asked him more questions. When Jamie returned from town with a few supplies, I proceeded to tell him about our curious visitor. I was amazed that Jamie didn't hesitate to believe in the Indian story about Takama. It seemed nonsensical to me, but Jamie was much more open-minded about things like this than I was. All I know, said Jamie, is these indigenous Indians are much more in touch with the land, the natural world, and the veil between this world and the next than we are. It's wise to listen to their advice in my experience, for they do appear to understand what it is they're talking about. If Takama doesn't want us cutting down trees in the Takama woodgrove, then we most certainly will not. That's all there is to it. The last thing I want to do is to antagonize a dead Bigfoot, he teased. A real live one would be problematic enough, but a dead one, that's a whole nother ball game. One that I'm not willing to tackle under any circumstances. Before long, my husband and I settled happily into our snug, comfy home, but moving to a new part of the world was a huge adjustment for us, a great upheaval that I'd never envisaged or even contemplated, but it had been worthwhile, for I didn't regret our impulsive, spontaneous decision to move. I loved North Carolina, the warmth of her convivial people, the charming small town, the stunning scenic vistas, fabulous panoramic views, and exquisite undulating countryside. What was there not to like? In no time at all we had formed real, solid and genuine friendships with people, purchased 3 American quarterback horses, 2 golden retriever dogs, and chickens, lots and lots of them. Life was exceedingly good for us. One day, upon the advice of a tree expert, he informed us that many of the red maple trees in the Takama woodgrove needed pruning and removal of some of those branches in order to eliminate structural issues with the trees. This was when we remembered the Takama curse. Did removing branches and pruning the red maple trees on our land subject us to this legendary curse? We were not at all sure. And so it was we ventured into the depths of the Takama woodgrove, like two intrepid explorers embarking upon a serious mission. I must concede that it was the most spectacular gathering of trees, for in their longevity and maturity they had grown into awe-inspiring, towering specimens. They looked like wizened monks, with full heads of glittering leaves that always transformed themselves into a rich bedazzling red colour during the autumn. They were gathered together in clusters. It felt as if they were watching us. I remember thinking that it was different to the other wooded trees on our land. It felt as if I was in the presence of infinite wisdom. The last time I'd felt a feeling like this was when I visited the Giza Pyramid Light Show on holiday with my parents several years back in Egypt. I remember the experience had left me with chills running down my spine. I had turned around to my father and exclaimed, "There is a God!" For in that mystical place I had seriously felt him. There was something outer-worldly, spiritual, enchanting, mysterious about this woodgrove. I was surprised to learn that Jamie was feeling it too, so I wasn't going completely mad. We walked through the whistling trees while a cool breeze blew against our faces. The trees were almost dancing as their little boughs bobbed up and down so gracefully in the wind. We ambled towards the large creek framed by a very bedazzling wooden bridge. I recalled the story of the 1800s girl who had so nearly lost her life here. It seemed almost surreal that I was staring in this very place where she nearly ended up, spending her life in a watery grave. All of a sudden, I could hear this thunderous sound. It sounded exactly like something hefty with powerful footfall blasting through the woods like a rhino or an elephant, making a beeline towards us. I held my husband's hands, squeezing them tightly, my own becoming wet and clammy. My heart pounding violently in my ears, and I was beginning to feel seriously nauseous. I could taste the bitter bile rising up at the back of my throat. I think we should go, I whispered to my husband. Something doesn't feel right. Shh, said my husband. We need to wait. The ponderous, looming vibration of leaden feet moving towards us sounded as if the earth was groaning, quivering, quaking under the weight of something hulking, prodigious, pronounced in size. I couldn't keep my eyes shut any more. I could feel a powerful, almost high-powered presence getting close to me. I could discern a sweaty smell. It wasn't rank. It wasn't pleasant either. I swiftly opened both of my eyes. Then I saw him. Nothing prepared me for what I was seeing. I let out a panic-stricken scream. Ah! When I saw a creature standing only yards away from me. After I screamed, my husband opened both of his eyes. His olive skin grew deathly white, his brown eyes as round as saucers. His body began to uncontrollably tremble, quake, and shake. He tried to scream, but his throat felt dry, scratchy, parched, and words eluded him. He stumbled to his feet, running backwards, his eyes glued to the creature all the while. It was a Bigfoot. A creature of monstrous proportions, so intimidating that my knees buckled beneath me as I rose to my feet from my seated position. I was so terrified I could not scream, nor could I run. I was afraid to look at the creature's eyes, as they warn you of such things, as challenging a predator is never advised. I couldn't help myself. My eyes were transfixed, mesmerized by this creature, as if I was cast under a powerful deductive spell. My eyes seemed locked in a trance. They travelled up from the creature's feet to his eyes. This thing was easily 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, 3 foot wide, with overlong arms, powerful shoulders, a pyramid-shaped head. It was significantly much more human than ape-like, but the long flowing dark hair that covered his body could potentially make a person class him as an animal. But not so. Without a doubt, he was a wild man. It was when my eyes met his that I realised he meant me no harm. On the contrary, he seemed somewhat bereft that we had reacted so adversely towards him. My fear waned, subsided, fluttered away, disappearing like a hot air balloon in the blue sky. That was when the creature glided towards me, handing me a single eagle's feather. He then looked at me with twinkling, bright, deep-set, dark eyes filled with humour, and glided away into the depths of the forest. Jamie ran towards me. We both hugged. "I thought the creature was going to harm us, but he was here to give us the eagle's feather. Oh my God, the legend is true. Even though it was a physical Bigfoot that gave us the feather, it gave us the feather on behalf of Tacoma. I can't believe it. The legend, it's true." Of course, it goes without saying that we succeeded to prune all the trees in the Tacoma woodgrove without any problems whatsoever. I will always ask Tacoma permission when it comes to dealing with trees in that woodgrove. I certainly know better now than to question the unexplained when things cannot be fathomed. It is better to concede that there are more things on heaven and earth that cannot be explicated or expounded, but in my opinion it makes the world a much more mysterious place, and I like it that way. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I drove down the familiar dirt road. The rubber wheels of my bright pink Jeep Wrangler had not graced this long driveway for over a year now. It seemed strange to be back here again in Iowa for the very first time in ages, returning to the old Richard family farmhouse where I had spent so many relaxing summer afternoons playing with my two best friends, Tammy Wilson and Sally Ann Richards, in our younger days. I had known those two girls since I was knee-high to a grasshopper when I was tottering around in nappies, as our parents had been lifelong friends, socializing and interacting together. After we left home to further our studies, we had always agreed that we would meet up here on the Richards family farm on the 15th of November every single year without fail. It seemed like a savvy way of keeping the connection between us alive. We all feared that we would lose touch one day, going our separate ways, making new friends, moving to other parts of the state, getting married, having babies, starting up a whole new life a world away from Iowa. It could so easily happen. The power of distraction is a natural threat. It lies in wait for you with the stealth and cunning of a tiger, pouncing on you unaware in the dark shadows, where she drags you under her forceful hold. Everything goes awry as the natural routines of daily life, the responsibilities, commitments, appointments all take hold, enough to sever the strongest of friendships. It was something we all feared and dreaded, as the idea of our friendship wilting away like a wild flower in an open field and dying was not something we were open to accepting. Granted, we did have the advantage of social media, but for us that bore little comparison from spending real physical quality time together. Growing up, we'd been as close as sisters, possibly closer. The one thing we all had in common is that we were all late lambs in our family. We were that unheralded present delivered to the front door so impetuously. My mother only discovered she was pregnant with me 6 months on, when she thought she was going through the perimenopause, while Sally Ann's father had a failed vasectomy. And as for Tammy Wilson, her mother went around town telling everybody that she was suffering dreadfully with the menopause. She talked about the menopause as if it was a contagious, infectious disease that you certainly didn't want to catch. "It's a very real phenomenon," she told her alarmed friends, who were now living with a rising level of trepidation as they wondered who would be next to experience the hot flushes associated with the change of life. "I've got it earlier than usual. Just my rotten luck. My hormones are flying all over the place like dandelion seeds. My mind is as wobbly as jello. I can't even remember a thing. My memory's like a sieve. I've become so clumsy, dropping things everywhere, all over the place. I feel nauseous and sick all the time, but luckily I can only say that I don't have those awful hot flushes they talk about. But the menopause belly, it's a dreadful condition. They never warn you about it. They never tell you how really bad it is on those television health programs," she said, her eyes growing really wide. "I think they don't want to alarm women of just how bad it really is. And the weight, oh, that's impossible to shift. I've tried every exercise, every diet, but my belly is growing like a balloon every single day, getting bigger and bigger. It's so inflated, my husband says I look like a beach ball. I think it might be exasperated by an allergy to dairy, as that can really blow you up." It never occurred to her that she might just be pregnant. One day it happened on her kitchen floor of all things, when her waters suddenly broke. Out popped little Tammy. As her husband put it so eloquently, "I left in the morning for work as a father of 3, to return home as a father of 4. It was quite remarkable. Very, very remarkable. I'm one happy man." Of course, all 3 fathers were really thrilled to be dads again. It seemed that Sally Ann's father believed he was startlingly virile. He had overcome, conquered, defeated a vasectomy. It was something he never failed to boast about to all and sundry, as if somehow he had accomplished an awe-inspiring feat, like climbing Mount Everest or swimming across the English Channel. He wore his illustrious acclaim like a badge of honour on his lapel. Going back as to why I was returning to the Richards family farm, well, it was the 15th of November again, the fixed date whereby we would meet up at least once a year. My mother had suggested this phenomenal idea to me. She seriously regretted losing touch with so many of her former hometown friends after university, whom she never heard from again. She really regretted that. So far, the plan had worked seamlessly, as for 3 straight years we'd never failed to meet up on this particular date. It wouldn't be a train smash if the date had to be altered, but luckily to date that hadn't actually happened. I had grown up here in Iowa, the land of luxurious rolling plains that sprawled out for an eternity, along with miles upon miles of pretty prodigious cornfields. I was raised here on a corn farm myself, not too far away from the Richards family farm, close to Highway 63 or thereabouts. Time had flown by so fast, so speedily. Where had it got to, I thought, as my car rolled past the wide-open meadows where the green grass was beginning to become bespeckled by yellow patches. Then there were clusters and clusters of hardwood trees, from maple, northern pecan, chestnut and black walnut trees, the latter being the most abundant tree on the farm. They stood together like towering tall strangers, covered with vast bushy heads of now yellow-green hair that contrasted superbly with the black bark. It was an exquisitely stunning November day in autumn, which wasn't unpleasant for the beginning of winter, as there were some pretty prisms of sunlight dancing all over the valley. But it was significantly colder, as there was a real bite to the air. I could feel my heart fluttering with excitement at the thought of seeing Sally Ann and Tammy again. It was so thrilling. Yet I also felt nervous. I often worried that we would change, become different people, lose that close connection that had anchored us together as friends for so long, like boats moored together at the harbour. Finally I reached the custom-made farmhouse that had been on this land as long as I could remember, but it was considered quite modern in its day. It was made from dark brown painted timber, with large glass windows, along with fabulous entertainment areas with floor-to-ceiling glass sliding doors that led from the living area onto the wrap-around porch that snuggled the house ever so tightly. It overlooked resplendent panoramic views of the idyllic Iowa countryside. My car engine purred as I navigated up the drive towards the parking bay that was fringed by some youthful oak trees. I pulled up the handbrake, switching off the engine, my eyes drawn to the front door. I could see a hazy silhouette, then a figure. It was Sally Ann, standing directly outside the bright red front door of her home, her blue eyes meandering towards my car. I could see her face looked animated. She was excited to see me. I glanced at her. Oh, she looked so pretty. Her pixie face sported a modern shag, a rather contemporary hairstyle enhanced with a few contrasting highlights in ash blondes and pale reds. It suddenly hit me how grown up she appeared. She looked like an elegant young woman now, not the naughty wild blonde-haired child I remembered playing with as a young girl. She ran towards me, her hair bobbing up and down, her blue eyes sparkling, flinging me into her arms in what I can only describe as the warmest, most compact hug. For a moment I thought she wasn't going to let me go. She was squeezing me so tightly I could barely breathe. "Tanya," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks, "it's been too long, far too long. I've missed you so, so much." "Don't get me started," I said, hugging her back, feeling the misty tears rising up in the back of my eyes. It felt so good to be together again, even if I was coming up for air like an oxygen-starved goldfish. Then it was Tammy's turn to arrive.
She did not escape the exuberant tight clutches from Sally Ann either, who welcomed her like a rambunctious Jack Russell who hadn't seen his owner in years. I could see her pale skin looked flushed with delight. She was ever so pleased to have been welcomed so enthusiastically by Sally Ann. She looked gorgeous as well, in an emerald green long-sleeved dress, while her long dark hair swept back elegantly in what appeared to be a pretty knot. It felt like we'd never been parted. "We're having an autumn barbecue," said Sally Ann, bubbling over with enthusiasm. She guided us through the opulent-looking entrance hall, with its stunning pieces of contemporary artwork, taking pride of place on the wall, through to the very stylish living area, swathed in luxurious furnishings done in rich golds and reds, onto the porch, where her father was manning the meat that he was cooking on a rather swanky open grill. I could smell those delicious nostalgic campfire smells that wafted over the patio, sizzling proteins, lipids, aromatic herbs, fruity smells that titillated my taste buds, causing my stomach to rumble hungrily. "It's good to see you kids together again," he said, greeting us warmly, as he flipped some burgers over on the grill. "It's been a long time, far too long. It makes me feel quite the old man, seeing how you've all grown up like this. Don't mind me. I'm cooking you lunch, leaving you to it, as Sally Ann has made it clear to me that parents aren't welcomed to your little tete-a-tete." "So you're not invited to our lunch, Mr. Richards, but you'll do nicely as the cook waiting on our every need," I teased. "Something like that," he chuckled. "Sally Ann has me well trained." "Oh, there you are," said Sally Ann's mother, rushing towards me, and to Tammy with open arms. Thankfully her hug was not as suffocating as her daughter's, but her welcome was intense. "So lovely to see the both of you. It feels like the good old days again, seeing you back here on the farm with us. My word, haven't you both grown into such beautiful young-looking women? It seems like only the other day you were running around in your nappies. It so grieves my heart that children grow up so fast these days." "You never know," I teased. "Maybe your husband's vasectomy will give again." "Not a chance," laughed Mrs. Richards. "That goose is well and truly cooked, I can assure you. I think we can safely say there will be no more late lambs." Before long, Sally Ann's parents had left us alone, and we were eating a delicious barbecue, with all the trimmings washed down with the finest French champagne. After we toasted each other, Sally was telling us that she had a party game planned for us. "In this hat I have some papers with questions in it. I ask you to tell the truth, that's all. Would you like to pick out a card?" she asked me. "All right," I said. "Here goes." I read it. "When did you first kiss a boy?" I flushed, the pink colour rising in my face. "Well, I was about 8 years old. I kissed Tommy Piper, do you remember him? Behind the Wendy house, in our backyard. He ran away from me, crying, never spoke to me again for years. Every time he came to our house, he would cling to his mother. He was terrified I'd kiss him again." "But you ended up dating him anyway when you were 18, said Sally Ann, looking surprised. "What made you kiss him?" "I don't know. I guess I always rather liked him. It wasn't even planned. I just did it. But it freaked him out." "Your turn," said Sally Ann, handing over the hat to Tammy, who took her time shuffling the papers around inside it. Finally she pulled out a little piece. It read, "Have you ever stolen anything? And if so, what? And why?" Tammy flushed. "I have, actually. One day when I was little, my brother asked me to look after his pet hamster. He was going away on a Boy Scout camp. I was so thrilled about being given the responsibility of looking after his little pet. It was a white hamster. I accidentally left the cage open. The cat killed it. I was absolutely mortified, too terrified to tell anyone what had happened. So when my mother went to the pet shop that day to buy some more pet food, I tagged along with her and went to play with the hamsters in the shop. When the owner wasn't looking, I stole a white hamster, stuffing the poor thing in my knickers." "You're kidding," I said. "You stuffed it in your knickers?" "I did. I'm not kidding. It seemed like the perfect hiding place where it wouldn't be seen. It was wiggling around frantically, but when I got home he was absolutely fine, thankfully. When my brother returned from his break a couple of weeks later, His white hamster actually gave birth to several little babies. He couldn't understand it because he had a boy hamster. How had it managed to morph into a girl? But I never told him a single thing. Wow, that really is some story. Did you ever confess to him about what you'd done when you were older? No, not on your Nelly. He'd never forgive me if I did. It's your turn now, I said to Sally Ann, handing her over the hat. She pulled out a piece of paper and read it. A secret you have kept from everyone. A secret you haven't told. It must come out right now. Sally's face grew grave. She stammered for a moment, as if she wasn't sure whether to tell us or not, which was a real bummer, as we had been friends for years. What was she holding back, I wondered? We told each other everything. Well, I thought we had. Come on, Sally, out with it, I said. Fair's fair. We've told you our deepest, darkest secrets. Now it's your turn. When I was 15 years old, I had an encounter with a Bigfoot. What? Piped Tammy and I together in astonishment. You never told us. We're your best friends. Why didn't you tell us? I'm not sure, said Sally. I just couldn't tell anybody. This was the story she told us. My parents had invited 2 couples over for lunch. I'm not sure who they were, as I'd never seen them before. I think they were connected with my father's work in some way. It wasn't uncommon for him to invite random guests over to lunch. I do remember my father saying that it was important to make a good impression on them. They were rather nice people, so I thought, friendly. I remember the one lady had a French accent, a very stylish, elegant woman she was, called Françoise. She was wearing an eclectic, long, stylish black dress with a big pendant on it. I remember thinking that she wouldn't look out of place at the Tate Art Gallery, talking to customers about great works of art done by some of the masters. She looked like, very artsy, but stylish, polished, classy at the same time. You could tell she was a passionate woman with a very engaging personality, the kind of person that would make an impact if she entered a room. Like that. It worried the heck out of me that she was chatting up my father so obviously. I could sense and feel a powerful attraction brewing between the two of them, but while my father remained indifferent, she looked quite predatory. I think Dad was thrilled to finally meet someone who shared his enthusiastic passion for contemporary art. Mum had never understood or appreciated his interest in art, but this woman, she clearly did. It was like Mum was blindly oblivious to the way Françoise was eyeing my dad up, like a rather ravenous female praying mantis. Well, you know how my mother can be so gullible, so over-trusting, fleeceable and naive. Well, she positively encouraged my father to go and show Françoise all his artwork, some of it that's stored in the outside barn away from the house. That really got me concerned. I remember trying to put a halt to it. I told Mum that Dad's stuff is all wrapped up in bubble wrap in the barn, that it would be such a huge, monumental mission for him to unwrap all that work, just to show Françoise. My mother said, "Oh, don't be so silly, Sally Ann. If Françoise is interested in your father's artwork, I don't think he'd mind unwrapping all that bubble wrap to show her some of his precious pieces." I thought I was going to throw up. I remember Françoise fluttered her fake eyelashes. She said, "Well, if it's not too much trouble, I really would be rather fascinated." That was when alarm bells began ringing loudly in my head. I was terrified that Françoise was going to pounce on my unsuspecting father. "You didn't trust your father with this woman?" I asked. "More like I didn't trust Françoise with my father. I mean, she looked like the type that aggressively pursued her quarry, a woman that hunts for the men she wants to seduce. I could predict that she would try and wheedle her way around my dad the moment she had him all to herself. I could just envisage it all happening. What troubled me the most is that Françoise was not the kind of woman you could reject very easily. She had an ego on her that would make a male lion look rather small. So once my father had shown her the artwork in the house, he proceeded to take her outside towards the barn. So I trailed surreptitiously behind them, keeping myself well out of sight. Once they'd finished opening up the pieces of art, I could hear the oohing and aahing, you know how they go over this and that. And then they came out of the barn, talking and laughing together, discussing some of the work. Françoise became blatantly flirtatious. They were about to return to the house to join the rest of the guests when I heard her say, I really love black walnut trees, especially at this time of the year. Why don't you show me your wood grove? I'm really interested." My heart began to sink as I sensed that Francoise wanted a great deal more from my father than just art and trees, much more than the wood grove itself. She wanted to frolic in the hay. That was what was on the cards for her. I just knew it. I felt it and sensed it in every part of my being. Francoise was saying, "I see that you and your wife don't share the same passion for art. It seems such a pity that you have so little in common with her." "Well, we may not have a lot in common when it comes to art, but we do connect in other areas," my father commented. "But do you really?" she said, stirring the pot deliberately, putting her hands up against my father, pushing him hard against the trunk of a tree, where she teasingly began to slide her long, painted, manicured, elegant fingers down the contours of his face, down his neck, and across his chest. My father looked a little alarmed, rather like a caged animal, not knowing quite how to react. He wasn't expecting this. He was completely caught off guard. I'd been following them closely and was peering behind a tree, watching this intimate moment unfold before my eyes between my father and Francoise. I wasn't happy, not one bit. I wasn't sure how to intercede, to break up this cosy, booming, romantic interlude that had the potential to get totally out of hand. All of a sudden, I heard a chattering sound. I looked up, and there was this huge creature hiding behind a large black walnut tree. His long, flowing dark hair was exactly the same colour as the bark itself. Very, very dark. At first, the creature just stood up. I worked out that it must have been about 8 foot tall. It could have been a youngster. It was lean, lanky, not really filled out yet. Its shoulders were exceedingly broad. It struck me as muscular, sinewy, powerfully strong, with overlong arms, a cone-shaped head, a hairless, leathery grey face, with a pronounced brow ridge, high cheekbones, flat nose, thin mouth, and deep-set dark eyes. The Bigfoot was watching my father and Francoise interacting together. He seemed to find it terribly comical. He was shaking his arch-shaped head from side to side, backwards and forwards, going, "Ah, ah, ah, ah," as if he was laughing at them. I'm almost positive that that is exactly what he was doing. He studied their body language very intently, very curiously. He began to imitate their actions precisely. He was impersonating Francoise to a T, who was now putting her arms around my father's neck and pouting as she leaned forward to kiss him on the lips. The Bigfoot copied Francoise's action, using his own body. He placed his overlong arms around himself, hugging himself, tracing the contours of his own high cheekbones, using the edges of his huge hands, just like Francoise had done on my father. Then he rounded his thin grey lips into a pout. He began to smooch the air, smacking his lips together, as if he was kissing. This extraordinary creature was replicating, acting out, if you like, Francoise's flirtatious advances so seamlessly towards my father. He portrayed my father's shocked reactions. I watched him suddenly widen his eyes like my dad had done, and look totally startled and shocked. I was laughing so much that I stuffed the corner of my shirt in my mouth so that my father could not hear me. That was when I heard my father say, "You're a very attractive woman, Francoise. It's so good to meet someone so interested in contemporary art like you. But I am a married man with children. I couldn't cheat on my wife. She is my very best friend. I'm very flattered. If I wasn't married, well, things would be very different, I'm sure." I'm not going to deny the fact that I was so thrilled to hear my father reject Francoise's amorous advances. She didn't take it at all well. She stamped her foot like a belligerent child. She said, "You're pathetic. You don't know a good thing when it's staring you blindly in the face. Have you ever heard of just letting your hair down, having a little bit of fun? What your wife doesn't know won't hurt her." "Oh, but it will," said my father. "It would prickle my conscience too much to ever cheat on her." "I might have known you were a complete loser," she said, storming back to the house. The Bigfoot copied Francoise's stamping movements. I saw my father running after her. I think he was telling her not to overreact or to take offence. But I don't think she was listening. She was very upset. So what happened after that? I asked. Well, I think the Bigfoot suddenly saw me watching him. He became quite reticent, actually. I don't think he realised he had such an appreciative audience. I remember his eyes twinkled with humour, but I also know he was painfully shy on seeing me. He just turned around, glided away. I did try running after him, but he vanished from my sight. He was gone. I never saw him again. Well, you've trumped all of us with your story, Sally Ann, I said. I can't believe you saw a Bigfoot. I feel positively overshadowed by you. To think that you've kept this from us for so long just boggles my mind. That all happened several years ago. Even though I'm married now with a toddler, I'm glad to inform you that I still meet up with my two very best friends on the same date every single year, as some things in life are worth preserving, and those are friendships. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, he was a monster of the humankind. His name was Wallace Keith. The trouble was that on the surface he looked halfway decent, but appearances can be deceptively misleading, as some of the world's most fearsome human predators have come wrapped up in the most benign packaging. In truth, he wasn't bad looking, quite attractive really, in a boyish kind of way, I suppose. He was about 6 foot tall, athletic looking, and very strong, with bright hazel eyes, a smooth olive complexion, and a full head of wavy dark hair. The trouble was, hidden behind his irreproachable, unassuming veneer that seemed so harmless and benign on the surface, was a very livid man, whose blood was boiling away angrily, like the lava from the molten rock of a volcano, that could potentially overflow in any given moment, or erupt, causing devastation in its wake, rather like a time bomb, just waiting for that perfect moment to explode. Such was the rising level of pugnacious wrath that was building up inside him furiously, for this man despised most people. It was ironic that he'd been brought up by decent, regular parents who had enveloped him with love, encouraged him, been his greatest cheerleaders in life, but he had never thrived nor flourished under their care at home, or even in the school environment. It would seem his own parents recognised that their son was inadequate, realising that he was socially disconnected, dysfunctional, detached, which would invariably impact his entire life very negatively. Over the years he had become like a reclusive hermit, whirling away the long lonely hours of the day in his bedroom, listening to music, or spent at the shooting range where he never tired of hitting targets, or at home punching the life out of his boxing bag, often attaching to the bag the face of someone he really despised, so that he could seriously enjoy punching their lights out. For he had no friends, nor did he desire them either. Over the years his record of dating women had not been at all successful. As he became so tongue-tied, he didn't know how to string two words together. When women interacted with him on blind dates or cumbersome social situations, the strained, tense silence was deafening. Indeed, it would become so overwhelming, awkward and discomforting that the lady in question would desperately look for an excuse to leave. If he did manage to say something, the words came out all wrong and would always appear offensive. He told a woman once her eyes were the colour of mud, while another woman was told she ate a lot, which was why she was so cuddly. She believed he was calling her fat, when he really considered her voluptuous, but it all came out wrong. It would seem that his bashful reticence, emotional repression, and crippling shyness was further compounded by a disabling sense of inadequacy, further heightened by a low self-esteem that ate away at his confidence like a worm in an apple from the inside out. How he resented, despised men who had the gift of the gab, who knew how to wrap women around their little fingers, to charm them, seduce them so seamlessly, for he longed to have a female companion for himself. It would seem that over the last couple of years he had developed an unhealthy fixation for a fine art student, a girl called Liesl Ackerman, who he thought was the most exquisite woman in the entire world. The first time he laid eyes on her was in a cafe in Banff, when she was having coffee with friends. He hadn't been able to stop staring at her, especially after she threw back her gloriously gleaming mane of long dark hair and burst out laughing.
She was so confident, self-assured, joyful, everything he was not. In that moment an insatiable love was born, as swiftly as the spark from a match, and before long in his mind's eye he had developed an intimate romantic relationship with this woman. In a trice he had found out absolutely everything about the unsuspecting student. It really was amazing what you could find out about someone if you were interested in them enough. There was not much he didn't know about Liesl Ackerman. The woman lived in his head daily, occupying every passing thought in his mind. She was there with him when he was eating cornflakes at breakfast in the morning, or when he was at the shooting range hitting targets, or even when he retired to bed at night. So constant was his interaction with Liesl in his mind's eye that he believed the two of them were so deeply in love. The problem with that was there was only one person aware of this relationship, and that was Wallace Keith himself. He knew that Liesl lived with her bohemian parents in a rather sizable rustic organic wooden cabin outside Banff, well off the beaten track, but not far from a public hiking trail where her father diligently took their two family dogs for their daily walks, one a golden retriever called Bo Peep, the other a Rhodesian ridgeback called Pied Piper. He knew she was in her second year at Arts College, was naturally talented as an artist who occasionally sold some of her pieces to the public, and without her knowledge he had purchased 3 pieces of her work to date that were hanging pride of place on his bedroom wall. He had also discovered that Liesl had 2 older brothers who had long since left home, one who was living in Florida practicing as a dentist, and the other who was living in Houston in Texas practicing as a doctor. It seemed both her parents worked in the tourism industry, offering skiing, horse riding and hiking trails and all kinds of outdoor pursuits for visitors to Banff. Liesl was a very svelte young lady in her early 20s, elegant and graceful, feminine to the core, with long dark hair that in certain lights possessed an auburn hue, green eyes and a rather translucent fair skin. She had that quintessential Basque look, like those people from the western part of the Pyrenees. To Wallace, the pale skin, along with the auburn dark hair, was so incredibly beguiling. It made her the archetype princess. In his mind, Wallace had laid claim to her, falsely believing that she belonged to him. If any man dared to date her, then Wallace Keith knew exactly what needed to be done, and that was to dispose of the competition. He meant that quite literally. No puns intended. Liesl Ackerman fumbled around in her purse. She was parked on a street corner in Wolf Street, in the town of Banff, after having been to the food court for a quick bite to eat. She had spent the entire morning at the Arts College, painting in Picasso Cubanistic style. She was thrilled with her dramatic self-portrait, with its contrasting colourful, cool and warm colour themes, portrayed in a series of cubes, along with the interesting Picasso eye, mouth and nose influences to the portrait. It was an exquisitely beautiful summer's day, in this beguiling Canadian resort town, which was graced with flowering hanging baskets containing blue and purple lobelia, along with pink and red hanging geraniums that hung outside the shops rather beautifully. Even the middle of the roads were embellished by large square containers overflowing with colourful blooms. Liesl never grew tired of Banff, not with the striking rustic architecture that embodied the heart of this thriving, enchanting vintage town, nor did she lose her passion for the interesting shops, cafes, and beguiling majestic views of the mountains swathed in white snow. With an artist's eyes, she truly appreciated beauty, so living in this part of the world meant that she could wallow in its resplendence, rather like soaking in a luxurious bubble bath. Oh, damn, she thought, as she began searching frantically in her purse to try and find her car keys. I know they're in here, but try as she might, she couldn't find them anywhere. Her eyes skimmed the driver's side window. Oh, there they were. She sighed. She could see them on the passenger seat of her white Honda SUV. She had only gone and locked her keys in the car. How could she be so crazy? It was typical of her, she thought angrily. She did tend to be a little absent-minded sometimes over the trivial things in life that, as far as she was concerned, did not really count. "Need any help?" came a man's voice. Liesl nodded. "That's if you know how to open a car that's locked. I've only gone and locked my keys in the car," she groaned. The man grinned, flashing Liesl a broad smile of perfectly white teeth. "Not to worry. I think I might be able to help you there, he said, pulling out a stray key from the pocket of his khaki pants. For a second, the man appeared to be scratching, fiddling and struggling with Liesel's lock, using a key that clearly didn't fit. Liesel sighed inwardly. Did this gallant stranger have a clue what he was doing, she wondered. Somehow she doubted it. Then suddenly the door opened. Liesel gasped. The man laughed. "Ha, ha, ha. You're not a car thief, are you?" asked Liesel teasingly. "How the heck did you manage that? I don't really know how to thank you." "Well, there is a way you can thank me," he said rather presumptuously. "How about a cup of coffee in town? I would really appreciate the good company." "Well, it'll have to be very quick," said Liesel. "I am rather pressed for time. You know, I've got 101 things I need to do." Before long, Liesel was seated at the table, at a very elegant coffee bar, where the pretty sunlight streamed over the eclectic, quaint furnishings, as they were both being served large cups of cappuccino, piled high with snowy peaks of voluptuous foamy froth. "Are you two married?" asked the waitress impertinently. "You make such a great couple. You're rather cute together, actually." Liesel flushed with embarrassment, her skin growing pink. "No, we're not married. Actually, we've only just met." "Really? Well, you look great together," chuckled the waitress. "If you do get married, don't forget to invite me to the wedding. Would you like any cake with your cappuccinos, by the way? We do have the most delicious apple pie with cream. It's to die for." "Well, go on then," said Liesel. "If you're having one as well, I will too." The man nodded. "Two it is," he chuckled. Liesel studied the rugged-looking man that was sitting opposite her. He was called George Huggett, with a full head of straw-coloured hair, bright blue eyes, and really quite the charmer, with an excellent sense of humour, she thought. Before long the day melted away as fast as butter in a microwave. It had flowed seamlessly, with much chatter, lots and lots of laughter. Coffee had somehow morphed into a snack. Then dinner, which was washed down with some quality Sauvignon Blanc. She didn't recall a time when she had laughed so much, to such an extent that her belly was aching. It hurt that much. "Do you know that man?" said George, his eyes rolling indirectly towards the stranger sitting at the table opposite them in the Italian restaurant. He was drinking coffee. "I swear that man has been giving me the evil eye all evening. He hasn't stopped glaring at me. He reminds me of an angry Rottweiler. I can't imagine what his problem is with me." Liesel glanced over her shoulders to regard the solitary man seated opposite them. His face suddenly lit up like a Christmas tree when Liesel looked in his direction. He flashed her a very rare smile. Liesel shuddered in disgust. Something about that man made her skin crawl. She regarded George with a befuddled expression upon her face, shrugging her shoulders in a nonchalant way, while her forehead broke out in a series of furrows. "Not him again," she whispered. "Wherever I go, I tend to see him. It can't be a coincidence that he's always around, can it?" she said, sounding a tad troubled about it. "I have no idea who he is, but I'm going to begin to take it personally if I keep seeing him loitering around me like a bad smell all the time." "Well, if looks could kill, I'm a dead man. If I may be so bold, could we do this again? I've heartily enjoyed your effervescent company today. I can't remember a time when I enjoyed myself as much as this." "Well, that would be very nice. I've also had a fabulous time, but just so you know, I'm not actually looking for a relationship of any kind. But I do enjoy going out for a good time." "Do you mind me asking you, have you got a boyfriend?" asked George, his face registering disappointment, his eyes almost losing their spark. "No, I don't have a boyfriend, but I'm so busy at the moment. I'm involved in some art projects, you see, that are consuming all my time. I'm preparing for an exhibition of my work with some of the other art students on our course. Of course, I'm open to going out for a good laugh on occasion for a bit of fun, if you're game for that as well." "Good. Well, then that's settled," said George, handing her his business card. "Give me a call." "Will do so," she said, smiling. Once again, thanks so much for helping me out with the car. You've no idea how much I appreciate it. Any time. As George walked away from the coffee bar, all he could think about was the beautiful girl he'd just met. What a bit of luck, he mused to himself, that he'd learnt how to remove a key from a locked car, something his brother had taught him as a party trick. He recalled the young girl's startled expression when he'd opened her door. He grinned to himself. His heart had almost twisted in a knot when she'd suggested she didn't want a relationship. But the good news, it turned out, she was actually young, free and single. He knew that she could be persuaded to change her mind about her relationship status. That wouldn't be too difficult. Besides, he liked women that presented a challenge. It was a long time since he'd met someone that just got his dry sense of humour like she clearly did. She was interesting, fun, and very easy on the eye. What more could he want in a woman? She was perfect, he thought, perfect for him. He quickly popped into the gents to relieve himself before he made his quick journey home, where he lived in a cottage on his family's farm outside Banff. All of a sudden, large hands seized him, thrusting his body violently against the wall, holding him down with a brute force. Then a fist ploughed into his face again and again, plunging into the soft tissues of his skin with a vengeful, savage spite. He felt disorientated, dizzy, confused, giddy. If he hadn't had that glass of wine, he might have been able to fight back a little better. He put up virtually no resistance. Once again he was being walloped in the face, in the left eye, above the mouth and nose. Bloody hell, that did hurt! He could barely open his eyes as he felt his eyeball was on fire. The man pulled out a long, thin knife, holding it up against his neck. What the heck was happening? Was he being robbed, he wondered? He could taste the salty, metallic taste of his blood rushing down his nose, into his mouth. He could barely see through his left eye. It was throbbing violently. "Take it!" said George, referring to his wallet. "It's in the back pocket of my pants. Take it, and stop hitting me. I'm not fighting back." Had things got so bad in Banff that in a gentleman's toilet he was being held up at knife point for his cash? What was the world coming to, he wondered. "I don't want your money," snapped the man. "You stay away from Liesl Ackerman. Do you get it? Or you're a dead man. Do you get it?" George nodded his head. The man sighed with relief, finally releasing his hold on George and replacing his knife in the sheath on his belt. He glared defiantly at George through belligerent hazel eyes and pointed a warning finger at him. "You leave Liesl Ackerman alone. Next time you're a dead man. You hear that, dead? Liesl's my girl. She's mine. Get that?" Then he was gone, vanishing from the men's room. "What was all that about?" said a man coming out from one of the toilet cubicles. "Bloody hell! You've been beaten up to a pulp, bro. Are you sure you're all right? Do you want me to call the police or an ambulance for you?" "Hell no, bro. Thanks for the thought, though, but I'll be fine." "If you're sure, bro. From where I'm standing, you look very badly beaten up. That dude that did this to you, he wants locking up, believe me." For a moment George stood there, feeling ever so disorientated, confused. What the hell, he thought. No one had beaten him up over a woman before. He studied himself critically in the mirror, barely recognising the horrific face that was staring back at him, bespeckled with blood, patches of purple, yellow and blue, the inevitable signs of bruising. He turned on the warm water faucet, cupping his stinging, throbbing skin with blasts of warm water, washing away the red stains. He noticed his swollen eye was darkening by the second, closing like a clam in a shell, so much so that he could barely see through it, as the huge swelling was now inflating his whole eye socket. In the morning he was in no doubt he would have a black eye. He looked like a total and utter train smash. As George reflected over what had just transpired, a light went on in his mind, rather like the beacon in a lighthouse. He had recognised that man that had beaten him to a pulp. That was the dude that had been giving him the evil eye in the restaurant. It was clear to him that this stranger had an obsession over Liesl Ackerman, But why? He had no idea. He'd be damned if he was going to be bullied or blackmailed by a complete stranger from seeing Liesel, the woman who claimed she didn't even know this elusive stranger. It was a very bizarre situation indeed, one that seemed incomprehensible to him. If Liesel didn't know this stranger, how was it possible he knew so much about her, including her name? Wallace Keith was beginning to realise that George Huggett was not paying any attention to any of his dire warnings. He was like that perennial fly that wasn't going anywhere, one that he wanted to swat to eliminate permanently. The man was buzzing around Liesel like a bee to a can of soda. What more could he do? He'd attacked the unsuspecting man in the toilet cubicles in Banff, punched his lights out, held him up at knife point. He had warned the dude off Liesel Ackerman, who was without doubt his property as far as he was concerned. The man was trespassing on holy ground. Liesel belonged to him. Things were getting seriously out of hand, as the man had seen Liesel 3 more times since that episode, willfully denying his warnings. Now he knew that action had to be taken, especially after he had the audacity to kiss Liesel on the cheeks after their most recent dinner date. Things were getting way too steamy for him. How dare he? Who did he think he was? Wallace could feel the rage burning up inside of him like an out-of-control wildfire. No one disrespects me like this, he thought fiercely. No one. George is going to pay big time for his transgressions. Wallace began to stroke his pistol affectionately, almost as if it was a beloved pet. He knew what needed to be done, so his plan seamlessly rolled into action. In the town centre he had purchased a cell phone. He took it out of its packaging. It was one of those cheap things. Finally he began typing a message to George, posing as Liesel. He hoped the dim man would not suspect a single thing, believing that Liesel had sent him the text, if all went according to his masterful, cunning schedule. He would make certain by tomorrow evening the problem of George Huggett would be put to rest for good. George looked up at his cell phone. It was lighting up. It made that beeping sound. Someone had sent him a message. He realised that he had received an SMS from Liesel. He could hardly believe it. His heart began to flutter excitedly in his chest. He read the note. "Meet you tonight at 10 p.m. in the woods, adjacent to my parents' home. You can park your car in the parking bay area there. The hiking trail is open to the public and dog walkers alike. Come and find me. I'll be there somewhere. I've planned a late-night picnic for us. Sorry, my phone number's changed. I lost my original cell phone. I'm busy today with my art projects. So just SMS me on this number if you can make it. Love, Liesel. P.S. I do hope to see you tonight." George chuckled to himself. He hadn't expected a message like this from Liesel. If she had planned a late-night picnic for the two of them, he was almost certain that she might be more interested in him than she was letting on. Over their last dinner date, she had appeared somewhat aloof, but this message suggested she was hoping for a romantic rendezvous. It seemed that Liesel was the adventurous type. A picnic in the woods, close to the witching hour, sounded like lots of fun. Should I bring a rifle, he wondered, in case of a mountain lion wandering around? Perhaps not, he thought. It might not look good to rock up for a picnic with a rifle in hand. He'd leave it in the car, he thought. George picked up his cell quickly, typing, "See you then. Looking forward to it, George." George felt thrilled about this little rendezvous as he parked his black Chrysler in the parking bay at the woods. He switched off the engine. The hiking trail wasn't far from where Liesel lived with both of her parents, in their whimsical little wooden cabin, where he dropped her off after their most recent date. It was exhilarating, enthralling, romantic even, meeting up in the middle of the night like this. He was surprised to see that Liesel's car was not in the parking bay. I mean, it was 10 to 10, for goodness sake. Perhaps she'd walked here, he thought. Had Liesel done this before? Invited her previous dates to the woods for a romantic evening under the stars, he wondered. It certainly was an exquisitely beautiful night, with an almost full golden moon that glistened brightly in the dusky sky, along with clusters of pretty silvery stars that sparkled so brightly, glittering like delicate twinkling jewels in the vast firmament. George quickly placed his headlamp on his head, very grateful for the illumination it provided. He then trekked a little awkwardly up the rugged, precipitous hiking trail into the depths of the woods, armed with a pretty bouquet of over a dozen red roses, a bottle of French champagne, and chocolate truffles. He did have reservations about bringing gifts, as he didn't want to scare Liesel away with the effusive romantic gestures, which might make him appear too keen, but then again, it would be awfully rude to turn up empty-handed, he thought. Now he had to find Liesel, but where was she, he wondered. He was sure she had erected a tent somewhere, over a pretty clearing with a fire pit. She was possibly grilling spicy chicken wings by now, but there were no delicious barbecue smells of sizzling fat and protein wafting through the woods, which was decidedly odd, he thought. He had never been in these woods before, but on this particular occasion the triangular shapes of the lodgepole pines seemed almost menacing, as a gentle wind murmured through the trees, while the pine needles jiggled ever so slightly, as if these tall, dark strangers were less than pleased to see him. It was almost as if they were whispering, "Stay away! Stay away! Stay away!" For indeed that is exactly what he discerned they appeared to be saying. Normally, nothing was more serene or uplifting than being in a pine forest, with the trees playing their celestial symphonies against the moving wind. But not on this occasion. Something felt wrong. Very off. Of course he knew exactly what that was. Everything was deathly quiet. There were no sounds of croaking frogs or chirping crickets, nor could he hear the staccato howls or yips of coyotes, or the raucous, blood-curdling screams of a female fox, or the long whoos of an owl. No, there were no noises at all, which was decidedly off. Certainly out of alignment with the natural world, he thought, unless there was a predator lurking somewhere around. A single chill spiraled down his spine like a powerful electric shock. He began to regret that he hadn't brought his rifle with him. It was so airily quiet in the forest, uncomfortable even. The silence appeared deafening. All he could hear were the crunching sounds of his own hardy leather boots, crushing twigs and pine needles beneath his heavy rubber soles, along with the rise and fall of his own chest, and a slight pounding vibration of his heart, suggesting that he was becoming increasingly uneasy. It was amazing how the camphorous, balsamic, citrusy smells of the pine needles were particularly strong at night, very uplifting, refreshing even, but nothing could dull the sense that something was off, really and truly off. Every part of his sensory perception was sharpened to this alarming revelation. He fumbled around in his jacket pocket for his cell phone. He would call Liesel, he thought, but he realised he'd left it on the dashboard of his car. Damn! The darkness of the forest grew increasingly hostile. He jumped out of his skin as dark, ominous shadows seemed to dance between the trees, giving him the very distinct, unsettling impression that he was being watched, or possibly even stalked. I need to get back to the car now, he told himself, to get my rifle and cell phone. He turned around to retreat from whence he'd come. He heard a distinct rustle, a movement, the sound of fast footsteps. "Liesel? Liesel? Liesel, is that you?" But there was no answer. Then he saw a dark, shadowy figure bounding towards him. He found himself staring down the barrel of a revolver, into the furious, enraged eyes of the man from the men's room in Banff, whom he should have reported to the police. "Did I not tell you to leave Liesel Ackerman alone? But you wouldn't listen, would you? I told you no good would come from it. I don't know who you think you are, but Liesel doesn't even know you. She is not your woman. She is my woman. She is mine. No one touches my Liesel. Do you hear me? No one." George watched in horror. He could see that the man was intending to kill him at point-blank range. He could see his fingers slowly pulling back the trigger to fire that lethal shot. "No!" he screamed. "No!" Suddenly he threw his body weight on the man, pushing his body back onto the ground, where he fell backwards, with George now on top of him. The bullet escaped from the barrel, plunging into the earth, bounding upwards and then ricocheting into the trees in an ear-piercing boom, missing both men. "What the heck is your problem, mate?" screamed George, as the two men began to wrestle each other. Wallace finally got the upper hand, rolling over George like a lion pouncing down upon its prey. George was now suspended under his weight, while Wallace began to violently punch his face once again. He could taste the salty metallic taste of his own blood, infusing the back of his throat. All of a sudden the forest began to boom, quake, thump, as heavy footfall blasted the ground, bounding towards them. Tree branches began to snap, crack, break, while the earth seemed to shudder, shake, and reverberate as this monstrous, colossal thing made its approach towards them. They could hear loud grunting and snorting. It was so terrifying that both men stopped fighting in their tracks as their fearful eyes glanced towards the strange noise that was growing louder and louder and louder as it neared them. The forest floor wobbled precariously, shaking like unstable floorboards, as if the ground was about to crack open like an egg. Then hurtling towards them was the most monstrous beast that either man had ever seen. But what in God's name was this bizarre thing? The strapping, robust, burly creature, built more powerfully than an army tank, was solid, sturdy, agile, strong. It towered at 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, 3 foot wide, with long arms that trailed below the knees, along with a pyramid-shaped head that flowed seamlessly into the shoulders. It was covered in dark, flowing black hair, blacker than the night, so black it almost emitted a bluish sheen. Its grey, leathery textured skin looked human, with a prominent brow ridge, flat nose and deep-set dark eyes that glittered with a menacing red eyeshine. It was frenetic, manic, hot under the collar, gnashing its teeth together, its ferocious eyes pinned directly onto Wallace. The creature began to roar as it swayed his head backwards and forwards like a frenzied branch in a blustering wind. It began to pound its chest with its oversized fists in a virile expression of dominance. George noticed a couple of areas of the creature's skin shone with sweat, clinging to his barrel chest, almost as if testosterone was oozing out of his pores. All of a sudden, the forest was filled with the pungent smell of rotten eggs that was so disgusting both men could feel nausea, clawing, stinging, burning the very back of their throats. In the moments when one is in a life and death situation, everything unfolds in very slow motion. What takes in reality only seconds seems to last for an entire lifetime. Wallace stood up. He began to run backwards, his eyes sweeping the forest floor for his revolver. His only hope of defence. Well, so he thought. The strange creature growled, lunging towards him, while Wallace began to scream, "No! No! Please, no! No! No!" George watched everything unfold before him, with bated breath, angst, and great trepidation, his eyes growing as wide as saucers. He felt as solid as an ice statue at a lavish banquet, for it seemed that in his terror his body had seized up on him like the faulty engine on a car that just wouldn't start. His efforts to flee were stifled by a pair of uncooperative legs that crumbled, buckling beneath him from the terror, so he couldn't even raise himself off the ground. His heart thumped violently in his ears, while electric spasms shot through his body like shooting stars as sweat poured down his face in raindrops. The creature lunged towards Wallace, grabbing him with a powerful, strong grip. He was fighting back, kicking, oscillating his arms and legs in wild, frantic gestures, but to no avail. The creature held him down with one mighty hand, and then with the other he twisted Wallace's head around itself like a cork. He plucked it off like a grape from a stem. George watched in absolute amazement as the creature grunted in satisfaction at his trophy. He displayed Wallace's head on a snap branch. It stared out vacantly into the forest, the glazed eyes as lifeless as a dead fish. George was certain he would be next on the chopping block, but the creature just looked at him, glided away through the forest, and was gone from his sight. The following day a lone dog walker discovered the head of Wallace displayed on a branch, but no one ever heard anything more about this story. Anyone who did possibly thought it was an urban legend, but I knew it was true. You see, I was there. I am George. I found Wallace's diary lying in a briefcase on the forest floor, and that was when I learnt about the mind of this irrational man, who truly believed he was in a relationship with Liesel, and who seemed to hate every other living human being. I never spoke of the incident to anyone for years and years. Why, I can't honestly say. Maybe I was afraid of ridicule, of people dismissing my story out of hand, as the rantings of a lunatic. Or maybe when you have an encounter such as this, that is so deeply personal to you, you have no wish to share it with anyone. I think the latter may be true. In case you're wondering, I did manage to talk that arty student around, and today I'm glad to tell you, Liesel is now my beautiful wife. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I was little then, possibly only about 12 years old, but the haunting memories of our family visit to the Mark Twain National Park in Missouri came flooding back to me like a spooky recurrent nightmare that tormented me when I dared remember or even reflect over the experience. I had buried the unearthly, indelible memory like a pirate's chest of opulent jewels in a secret, undisclosed place that no one would ever find. But instead of hiding it in an underground cavern, I had shrouded it in the very depths of my mind, in a dark, neglected, forsaken place where it was gathering dust, cobwebs, dirt. I had hoped with all my heart that the airy, stirring memories would be wiped away, forever erased, exterminated by the long passage of time, to be remembered no more. For no one in my family ever spoke of the incident again, not even to each other. It was so much better that way, so we thought. If something was so bad, you should prudently, judiciously choose to obliterate it, expunge it, wipe it away like the spilled mess on a kitchen surface that you washed off with a warm sponge, soaked in a detoxifying lemon detergent. Then it was gone, forgotten, clean. If you couldn't see it, then it would never hurt you, nor ever come back to bite you or torment you again. For meditating on the memories or rewinding it in your mind like a tape recorder over and over again only served to make things 1,000 times worse. My mother informed us it would bring along with it the post-traumatic stress disorder, much like the American soldiers experienced after the Vietnam War, when the horrendous horrors of those harrowing battles lingered over their lives like a repugnant, hideously bad smell that could not be abated. The stench of those memories infused their lives like a powerful, potent perfume. It coiled and wormed its way around their minds like a boa constrictor, sucking and squeezing all the good thoughts away, until all that was left were the haunting, evocative, poignant memories of gunfire, battle, blood, death, destruction, horror. I had listened to my mother, wilfully choosing to forget it had ever transpired, but the very name, the Mark Twain Forest, turned my blood cold, sending wistful chills of dread down my spine, along with the bitter taste of nausea rising up at the back of my throat like a powerful waterfall of sour, toxic water that made me want to gag, it was so vile. "Did you hear me, sweetheart?" said my husband, as he drove our blue SUV truck down the smooth tarmac road on our return journey home, back from the small town. "You've gone all white. I was just saying that it would be great to take my sister Lydia to the Mark Twain National Forest for a day out when she visits us next week for her week's holiday. It would be good to give her a taste of Missouri, a far cry from her life in Portland, I shouldn't imagine. It would be a treasured, arresting experience for her that will be stamped on her memory forever." "But why Mark Twain National Park?" I argued defensively. "There are lots of lovely places we could take her to. Why there?" "And we will. But why not Mark Twain Forest?" asked my husband, his brow beginning to furrow. "I've always wanted to go there. I believe it's an awe-inspiring place that is worth a visit." I just don't think it's a good idea. That's all." "Don't be silly," said my husband, grinning at me. "It's a great idea. Go on. It'll be lots of fun. Don't be such a wet blanket, sweetheart.
It's our responsibility, as Lydia's hosts, to show her a very good time, don't you think? If the boot were on the other foot, she would do the very same for us when we visit her in Portland. She'll stop at nothing to introduce us to absolutely everything and show us a fabulous time. We should extend to her the very same level of hospitality." I grimaced inwardly, not wanting my husband to discern the distraught, discomposed expression that was beginning to develop on my face, the little glint of fear sparking in my eyes. I'd always been introverted, reticent, self-contained by nature. Although I shared my deepest secrets with my husband, this was one I had kept under strict lock and key. "Do what you like, then. You always do." "Fine. We'll go to Mark Twain National Park, if it makes you happy." "What's wrong with you? You're being very sarcastic, abrupt, thorny. You really do seem rather peaky, if you don't mind my saying so. Are you sure you're all right, sweetheart? You're not coming down with something?" he asked, rubbing his hand over my forehead. "You don't feel hot at all?" "I'm fine. I think I'll just go and lie down for a while when we get back. I feel a little queasy, with a throbbing headache coming on, I think." "Well, you go to bed. I'll unpack the car and place the shopping in the cupboards and refrigerator. Call me if you need anything." So there I was, lying abandoned, alone, like a half-drowned kitten on a desert island, clinging to life, filled with fear, dread, trepidation, as to what the ominous future would invariably hold for me, as dreadful images of Mark Twain National Park flashed through my mind like an ambulance's bright blinking red light that seemed to warn the very cockles of my soul to never ever return to that abhorrent place again. I was covered in a cosy quilted duvet that blanketed my entire body. The long velvety block-out curtains of our windows were drawn. Our room was enveloped in a comfortable, soothing darkness, while the light of the bright day had been cast out. I lay back on my soft pillow. There I was in my mind, clawing away desperately at the dusky trunk in the dark recesses of my mind. It contained the memories of my time at the Mark Twain National Forest. I didn't want to open it again, but despite everything, I did. I had to. All of a sudden the memories came bounding back, rather like a rabbit emerging from its burrow. There I was, 12 years old again, seated in the back of my parents' truck. Mark Twain Forest sits in the heart of the American Midwest, sprawling across 1.5 million acres of rugged highland, strewn with volcanic mountains, vast areas of natural wilderness, and networks of underground caves that have spanned antiquity. This ancient forest was considered by many the quintessential perfect hiding place for Native Americans, gangsters and outlaws in the days of old. Many believed it was an evil place where dark, insidious forces from the underworld rose up from beneath the ground through a portal brought on by magic spells, rituals, incantations that had willfully been unleashed into our reality. The terrifying demons and beasts of which many visitors to the park over many years claimed to have encountered. My parents had dismissed such allegations or rumours as idle speculation, even gossip, but now we were driving down the dirt road in a remote part of Mark Twain Forest with my younger sister seated on the back seat with me. Something felt distinctly off. It unsettled me, caused my insides to become twisted and knotty. We were looking for our campground and driving around in circles completely lost. Why was it so difficult to find our camping site? It couldn't be that hard, surely. I could see us laughing in the truck as we drove down this remote road, surrounded by dry trees and rugged landscape, while my mother passed around the hard-boiled sweets. "Never mind," she had joked. "Getting lost is all part of the adventure. I'm sure your father will find his bearings sooner or later." I remember, as I glanced outside of the window of the back seat, I was thinking that the curvaceous shapes of the trees looked spectral, haunting, sinister, and that was when the landscape visibly seemed to darken. All of a sudden my father's blue truck began to stall, until it ground to a halt. He looked up at us in astonishment. I don't understand it. I have a full tank of petrol, but the petrol gauge is registering empty, he told us. What the heck is going on? I could hear the panic rising up in his voice that he desperately tried to conceal from us, but his raspy tone barely ever raised itself beyond a soft drawl. But his syllables had become pronounced, almost squeaky, piercingly high. I could tell my father was becoming unhinged. "Sweethearts," said my mother, sensing my father's rising level of trepidation and angst, "why don't the two of you make a quick call of nature by those trees over there? You see them? While your father tries to figure out exactly what's wrong with the gas tank." My sister and I eagerly climbed out of the back seat together. "Dad's really scared," Kayla whispered to me. I can hear it in his voice. We trekked over to a couple of trees and began to pee. I glanced up from where I was peeing. "Look," I whispered to my sister. "Look over there. Can you see her?" My sister glanced up, her face registering horror. We saw a sombre-looking woman, shrouded by a long black veil that covered her head. She was swathed in an onyx velvety dress that fitted snugly around her waist like a tight-fitting, figure-hugging corset. It flowed down in a wide A-line skirt that was so long it covered her feet. She was staring at us, but her eyes were as black as pitch, so evil, inauspicious. They were glinting with a lugubrious, doleful red eyeshine that is not natural nor of this world. She was grotesque-looking, her unnaturally white face weathered by hundreds of crinkled lines, her dark, desolate eyes rimmed by a purple blackness. The crooked, gruesome smile on her face looked vindictive, hostile, malevolent. Trembling, my sister and I ran backwards, turning around to hightail it back to the truck, our hearts thumping loudly in our ears, our throats tasting the bitterness of bile on our tongues, our bodies trembling like jello. We climbed into the truck, slamming the doors hard behind us, devastated to see my father was struggling to still get the engine started. I looked back from whence we'd come. The witch was standing there, looking at us, the grin on her face widening every second. I felt nothing but despair. "Go, Dad! Go!" I cried. "There's an evil witch out there in the woods! She's grinning at us! Please, go! Go! Go!" "Sweetheart," said my mother, "calm down. There isn't a witch out there. It's getting dark, so the shadows are just scaring you." "No, there really is a witch out there," my sister cried. "We saw her. She's watching us. Please, Dad, go!" All of a sudden, the woman was standing in front of our truck, facing the front windscreen. My mother then began to scream. "Go!" she screamed to my father. "Go! Go!" My father was still grappling with the engine. "Who the heck is that?" he said, referring to the woman, his hands beginning to tremble, his face wearing an expression of total and utter terror. The witch was oscillating her arms wildly, as if beckoning to something, almost as if she was calling something up from the shadows. Then we heard a dog barking. It got closer, closer and closer, and then dashing through the undergrowth towards us was a raven black hound with red eyes, sharp fangs, and a hostile growl that was so unsettling it rumbled like a volcanic explosion. This monstrous thing mounted our truck, pounding onto our windscreen with its powerful paws, glaring in at us with these outer-worldly abominable red eyes. I'd never seen anything so hideously ugly, so twisted, so repugnant in my entire life. This dog-like creature, if you can call him that, rolled back his thin canine lips, revealing dagger-sharp white teeth that made a Rottweiler's jaw seem like a pussycat. Out of his mouth, blowing like a stormy wind, was a low guttural growl, unlike anything I've ever heard before or since. The creature began scratching away at our windscreen glass with its jagged claws. He was fighting, clawing the window, desperate to break the boundary glass between us, to tear us limb from limb into hundreds of thousands of pieces. Our truck was filled with our ear-piercing screams, one of which was my own. Finally, my father got the engine started. Once again, the petrol gauge registered a full tank of petrol. But even as we accelerated away as speedily as we could, This unnatural beast, now on the road, ran beside our zooming truck, easily outrunning a cheetah. Finally, the creature vanished from sight and was gone, leaving behind a trail of devastation in its wake. I say that because the devastation I talk about was left in the hearts of all of us, as from that moment on, I knew that my life would never ever be the same again. How could it be? A deep trauma now lay buried within the depths of our souls, locked now in my hidden trunk that I had never wanted to open again. My mother had spoken to our pastor about this matter. He perceived that we had encountered a demonic spirit known as the Hellhound, who is believed to guard the very gates of hell. The pastor told us to give the devil no house room. Never speak of this event again to anyone. Don't give the evil one an ounce of publicity, for that is exactly what he wants. Brush it away, hide it, never ever think of it again, for if you do, it will destroy you. Fast forward to the arrival of my husband's sister Lydia from Portland. I didn't know her well enough, because when we got married she was living in London, gaining some work experience at an illustrious design company, specialising in zooty top-of-the-range kitchen gadgets and appliances, many of them that had not been introduced to the American marketplace yet. Unfortunately, she'd been too busy to attend our wedding. I had met her once before, but knew little about her. But over the last few days I had gotten to know her better. I'd never met anyone like her before. She was different, quirky, quite a spiritual person, really. We'd taken her to the Lake of the Ozarks, the Natural War Museum, the Herman Wine Trail, the St. Louis Zoological Park. Now we were taking her to the Mark Twain National Forest, the latter being my worst nightmare, something I was most certainly dreading. I wanted to protest about it, I really did, but my throat dried up, became scratchy. I found it almost impossible to express my misgivings and indignation about visiting the park, especially since Lydia was so enthusiastic about the trip. Luckily, we weren't camping there overnight, but just visiting the park was disquieting enough for me. So I prayed that God would send an angel to keep us safe, so that what transpired to me at 12 years old would never repeat itself again. "What's wrong with you?" asked my husband. "Every time I mention the Mark Twain Park, you go decidedly peaky. Is there something that you're not telling me?" No, I'm absolutely fine. I've been there once before, that's all. It wasn't that great. My father's truck was registering no petrol when we had a full tank. Then it began to work again. It was rather weird, that's all I'm saying. "Well, that's just probably a bit of bad luck. Maybe you'll feel differently about it this time," he chirruped encouragingly. There we were, driving our truck through the Mark Twain National Park. Perhaps my husband was right after all, I thought, as we drove through the forest, past some of the rugged wilderness, the rocky barren glades, old volcanic mountains, streams, and acres upon acres of pine forests. Everything was so green, so beguiling, so beautiful, so dramatically different from when I was last here. I was worried about nothing, I thought with relief. The place seemed innocuous, non-threatening, positively benign. Before long we were having a fabulous picnic by an idyllic silvery stream, where the water jetted, thundering over the rocks, babbling, rippling and trickling as it moved. We spent most of the day talking, laughing, enjoying the crisp, fragrant fresh air that smelt deliciously of pine needles, along with the peaceful tranquillity of the place. We prepared a fire pit, cooked a delicious, delectable barbecue, and got so caught up in the moment as Lydia and I sipped on glasses of white wine. But as my husband was driving, he wisely just sipped on cans of Mountain Dew. The day evaporated quickly, as it invariably always does when you're having a really great time. The flaxen, refulgent sun set over the arresting valley, in a whirling, beautiful sea of golds, oranges, tangerines, while the sky shimmered in a resplendent glaze, until finally it all dissipated, until it was gone. It was time to go. Even I was reluctant to leave, but it was getting late. The time had slipped away so fast. In a trice, a blanket of darkness had swept over the valley. "We need to go," said my husband. "I don't know what happened to the day." "I told you we would have fun, sweetheart," he said, giving me a little nudge. "It wasn't so bad, was it?" I giggled. "You were right," I said. "It was fun." I can't thank you enough, the both of you, for such a wonderful day, said Lydia, sliding comfortably into the back seat of the truck. I can't remember a time when I enjoyed myself this much, she said. It's so good to be able to knock back all that delicious wine and not worrying about driving. Thank you, brother dear, for staying teetotal. It's very good of you. My husband started up the engine. Our truck glided smoothly down the long road. I glanced out of the window briefly. The triangular shapes of the towering ponderosa pines jiggled in the slight breeze against the hilly escarpment. It felt as if distant eyes were looking at us. Flashes of the evil witch I'd seen at 12 years old began resurfacing in my mind. I could see her as clear as day in my mind, as if I was 12 again. "That's funny," said my husband. "My petrol light is flashing," he said. "But I have a full tank of petrol. That doesn't make any sense to me." The car began to stall. My husband's truck ground to a halt. I could hardly believe it. It was happening all over again. Surely lightning didn't strike in the same place twice. The truck ground to its halt, while my husband frantically began to fiddle with the engine. "I can't get the bloody thing started. My petrol tank claims that it's empty, but that is impossible." "What's that?" said Lydia, pointing towards this large figure gliding hurriedly towards us, moving with such grace until it was standing only yards away from our truck, looking directly in at us. I could hardly believe it. The creature standing before us, larger than life, was a Bigfoot. It was my turn to be completely astonished. I'd seen television programs about Bigfoot before, but seeing one in real life was a whole nother story. I should have been terrified, but my shock was suppressed by a strange excitement as I felt butterflies flapping inside of me. I was intrigued, amazed, bedazzled, electrified to see such an anomalous creature in our reality. Besides, he didn't appear menacing nor aggressive, although his size was very intimidating and daunting. I'd never been good at estimating size, weight or girth, but I think he must have been about 9 to 10 foot tall, just slightly under 1,000 pounds, and 4 foot wide across the shoulders. He looked more human than ape-like, although he was covered in hazel-brown hair, long and flowing, while his upper torso was hugely muscular, dense with pronounced sinewy definition. His pyramid-shaped head beheld a handsome human face that had a look of an indigenous Indian warrior, as his leathery skin seemed deeply bronzed, his cheekbones very high, his sloped forehead deeply furrowed. His deep-set dark eyes were almost almond-shaped, possessing those typical heavy lids. His kindly, gentle, serene face wore a benevolent but concerned expression on it. "The Bigfoot is here to help us," said Lydia, her voice going soft. "He's speaking to me telepathically. He is telling you once again to start up your engine, to get out of here as quickly as possible. He said the portal to the underworld is now opening. There is an evil presence that brought your wife to this place again. It wants her." "Bloody hell," said my husband. "Is he really speaking to you, Lydia?" "Absolutely. I can hear him as clearly as if you were speaking to me. Better even." Sure enough, my husband's engine began to start. The creature ran ahead of our truck. The Bigfoot ran like a cheetah. I'm not kidding about that either. He knew how to run very fast. Finally, we found the road that led to the intersection, and the Bigfoot waved us off. He was then gone from our sight. I could hardly believe it. When we got home, Lydia looked at me intensely. "Why didn't you tell us that you had a demonic encounter when you visited the Mark Twain forest before? You do realise that the evil one was calling you back to mess with your head." "I didn't want to talk about it," I stammered. "Well, you're lucky that you prayed for protection. That's why the Bigfoot came to our rescue. We would potentially still be trapped in that forest right now, unable to start the truck, being tormented by spirits of the underworld that feast on the energy of our terror. It's like a sugar addiction for them. They lap up and drink our fear as if it's Kool-Aid. The Bigfoot told me that devil worshippers that had visited the forest over many years have performed sacrificial rituals to the devil at the Mark Twain forest, worshipping the devil by slaughtering wild animals. That these demonic rituals have inadvertently opened a portal to the underworld, where demons are permitted to enter our reality, as they're invited in by devil worshippers. They are monstrous creatures from this outer worldly realm that are now loitering around our forests at night, creatures that are outlandish and anomalous, eager to dine out on our terror. How can you know all this? I asked Lydia. How could you possibly hear the Bigfoot speaking to you? I don't understand. Lydia's a sensitive, said my husband. She has the God-given gift of discernment. She can see beyond the veil what most of us cannot see. I never told you this, sweetheart, but Lydia has been able to see into the spiritual realm all her life. When she was young, she was very traumatized by what she could see. But now she's been able to help people with her gift. Who have you helped? I asked. Well, a young man went missing from a club once, said Lydia. I could see exactly what had happened to him. It unplayed in my mind like a movie. It would seem that he got caught up in a fight over a woman. The man slashed his throat. You saw it all? I asked, looking absolutely astonished. She saw everything, said my husband proudly. The police were astonished. The perpetrator was arrested. The family were finally able to grieve the loss of their deceased one. As thanks to Lydia, the body was recovered. That happened about 8 years ago. If there is any message to this story, I'd like to say that if you get caught up in a dangerous predicament, don't ever forget to pray. Help may come to you from an unlikely source, in the form of an angel, but that angel may not always be wearing wings or dressed in white, for some angels are indeed among us. On that day, the angel that led us to safety was a hairy humanoid creature known as Bigfoot. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, the last time I'd seen Anna Barok was at a local Take the Plunge event in our small rural town. The event was birthed from a random competition hosted by our local cheese shop to see who could make the best chutney. The winner would receive $1,000, along with their chutney recipe becoming commercialized, sold across all of North America, at upmarket delicatessences and select food shops nationwide. The spontaneous event soon morphed into all other kinds of competitions, as inspired shop owners got on the bandwagon, using this quintessential opportunity to offer their own competitions, all in the name of branding, promotion, and free advertising. Everyone in our small town was taking part. Even the butcher had a specialized competition for the best barbecue and hot sauces, while the greengrocer had a competition for the best homegrown vegetables, but it wasn't based on their size, but on the taste of the vegetables, I'm glad to say, as at the end of the day, it truly is the flavour that counts. The baker had a competition for the best pineapple upside-down cake, the best cheesecake, the best chocolate brownies, and the best Boston cream pie. Then there were prizes for the best vanilla fudge, shortbread, and chocolate chip cookies, so everybody was very excited about this upcoming illustrious event. I remember people were bustling around our small town, buying the ingredients to rustle up unusual recipes to see who could turn out the best chutney or the best upside-down pineapple cake. The competitive spirit was ablaze in our small town, rather like the dazzling bright lights of a Christmas tree. For even if they weren't ready to admit it, everybody wanted to be a winner. I remember my mother made 5 batches of chutney, each far worse than the previous one, as she tried to concoct these weird and wonderful flavours that certainly did not work together. But I guess one could commend her for being rather creative, industrious, and imaginative. For indeed, one of her chutneys was so hot, I thought it would literally blow my head off. My mother's grandmother originally came from England, so she always told us the story about Bakewell tart. It would seem that Mrs. Geeves, who was a landlord of the White Horse Inn in 1820, left instructions for her chef to make a jam tart. Instead of stirring the almond paste in the recipe and adding it to the pastry, he put it on top of the tart, alongside the jam. It tasted so good, even though it was a mistake, and now Bakewell tart is sold in bakeries throughout Britain. My mother made it for us once. It was absolutely delicious. It's a tart filled with cake and jam, covered with fondant. I think my mother assumed that she could come up with a brilliant, innovative, genius recipe, completely out of this world, rather like Mrs. Jeeves's cook had done, with his enthralling, outstanding, smashing recipe for Bakewell tart. I think she envisaged she would knock everybody's socks off, but so far she was failing miserably at every attempt. "Maybe you're just being rather adventurous, sweetheart," my father had spouted, when he was forced to taste one of my mother's masterpieces and was less than enthused about the idea.
as my mother's chutneys became less and less palatable as the experiment ensued. "Well," said my mother excitedly, "how does it taste?" "Not very good, I'm afraid, sweetheart," said my father very honestly. "I can see that aniseed in a chutney on the surface may sound very appealing, very interesting, but licorice and cheese, I'm sorry, they don't work together."
"Well, how do you know that they don't actually work? Other people might like it," she protested indignantly.
"I think, sweetheart, that it is very unlikely that aniseed will go down well with the community. You should perhaps focus on simplicity. Have you not heard the saying that less is most definitely more? If you put too many flavours in your chutney, I think they can fight each other."
"Oh, don't be so ridiculous, Frank. The whole idea of this competition is to come up with an ingenious idea."
"If you say so, dear," said my father, raising a brow, as he caught my eye. He rolled his eyes in the back of his head. I giggled. I knew he was saying that my mother was being deliberately contrary. There was no reasoning with her, or bringing her to her senses. I remember rewinding the day of the competition in my mind to the moment when the 3 judges tasted my mother's chutney, after sampling a sea of other chutneys, before they finally reached hers, where the names of all the participants were now concealed. I waited with bated breath, my heart in my mouth, as they dipped their biscuits into her syrupy concoction. At first they discussed the texture and appearance of the chutney, all nodding in agreement. I could tell that they were impressed with how the jam-like substance dribbled from the spoon. I watched all 3 judges' eyes grow round in astonishment as they politely chewed my mother's chutney, hurriedly swallowing the biscuit down as if they were about to choke on it. They eagerly glugged down some water to extinguish the flavour. I could determine by the disgusted expressions on their faces that they wanted to spit it out, but they were politely determined to not cause any offence. My mother looked absolutely mortified, while my father tried to refrain from laughing out loud. One of the judges said, "Interesting. I've never tasted a chutney quite like this before." I never dared ask my mother what was in it, but I could only imagine. In the end, my father was absolutely right. The person who won the competition for the best chutney was Mrs. Claire Armstrong Jones, who made a very simple peach chutney recipe that she found in an old 1800s recipe book, so perhaps the classic recipes are the safest after all. Going back to Anna Barok, she was not the kind of person you would miss in a hurry, for she dressed in loud, lurid, gaudy colours, usually blazing obtrusive reds, pinks, yellows and oranges, while her reticent, polite husband was overshadowed by her at every single turn. I think that was the whole point, really. Mrs. Barok simply loved being the centre of attention. Imagine a bright, flamboyant, colourful painting for a moment that is so vibrant, so eye-catching in its colour. It grabs you so much that the softer, subdued and subtle colours in the background simply fade away. Her husband was the soft background colour that was almost surplus to requirements, so to speak. He would rarely be observed, and would just shrink in the background like a blot on the landscape. People would often ponder after they'd encountered Anna Barok as to whether Jacques had actually been with her or not, when they'd last seen her. It almost always escaped their minds, but invariably he had been there, but no one had even noticed him. One almost felt sorry for the poor man, who was rarely ever acknowledged by the locals. As any skilled artist is likely to tell you, it's very often the background colours of a painting that serve to enhance, to uplift the vibrancy of the work, with a blended sequence of tonal contrasts, variants and shades. For indeed sometimes these colours are the most significant of all, as they add great depth to the work. In the same way I truly believe Mrs. Barok would have been nothing without her husband Jacques, despite the fact that he seemed so innocuous. My father always thought Mrs. Barok looked like a chicken. She carried her ample weight around her middle, that was buttressed by the skinniest legs that you've ever seen. Sometimes it was hard to believe that her tiny thin pins could actually hold her up. The brassy woman was loud, obnoxious in every way, not afraid to air her dirty laundry in public. On the contrary, she enjoyed publicising the contentious issues that arose in her personal life. She spoke her mind, never afraid to say exactly what she thought, which invariably caused offence among many of the locals, who sometimes took her cutting remarks quite personally. It would seem she acquired for herself a long list of enemies. She was not well liked in our small town, yet you could never ever avoid her, nor ignore her. She was like that unfortunate tree fallen over by the storm in the middle of your road, blocking your path home. It was not uncommon on a Sunday after church to see Mrs. Barok mouthing her opinion on every single matter, from the quality of the sermon, to the taste of the food, to the clothes the people were wearing that morning. Regretfully, her critical observant comments were rarely generous, but more likely rude, offensive, and even unkind. I don't think she meant to cause upset, but she had about as much tact as an alley cat, and the subtlety of a bull elephant standing in your living room, larger than life. "Oh, it's my husband who's boring you," she would say, intruding in on our conversation when people had gathered together for a chat. "I'm afraid he's very, very dull, but I'm the one that has to live with him, not you." On the day of the town hall gathering, I do remember Mrs. Barok coming up to my mother in her bright, shimmering purple dress, wearing a big grin on her face. "What was in your chutney?" she asked my mother. "Whatever it was, the judges were quite simply appalled. Remind me to never come to your house for dinner, girl. You knocked their socks off, dear, but not in a good way, I'm afraid to say. You could market your chutney to use as gifts for people you don't like," she chuckled. "I might just buy one for you for my brother." That was the last time we'd seen Mrs. Barok alive. Now we were being questioned by the sheriff in our home, as Mrs. Barok had disappeared, gone missing, vanished off the face of the earth. No one knew where she was, nor did they really care either, as the town seemed quieter, more peaceful without her. Her husband had reported her missing. Tongues were wagging all over our small town. As rumours circulated, people speculated, theories abounded, ideas rocketed, people gossiped, and boy, did they gossip. "He finally did her in," whispered Mrs. George. "I can't say I actually blame him. Poor, poor man. I think I'd have done the same, wearing his shoes, if I had to live with her. Maybe he put antifreeze in her jello, buried her under the patio." "That's a bit extreme," said Mr. Rogers. "I don't think Mr. Barok would have done her in as you suggest. But it is decidedly odd, I have to admit. I mean, she wears such intrusive bright colours. She's larger than life, whatever you may say about her. She sticks out like a sore thumb wherever she goes. You can see her from miles away. Someone must have seen her, surely. People don't just vanish off the face of the earth like this, do they?" Of course, when Sheriff Jason Carter arrived at our home to question our family, we were the first to be surprised to hear about the disappearance of Mrs. Barok. But the sheriff asked me, my younger sister Lorelei, and both of my parents when was the last time we'd seen her alive. "So the last time you saw Mrs. Barok, you are saying you were at the Take the Plunge event hosted in the town on Sunday, am I right? You are sure about this? You didn't see her on the Misty Hill walking trail at any time, did you? I gather your family walk there sometimes with your dog. It's quite a remote trail, is it not? A little inconvenient to access for most of the locals, but certainly not for you. Well, you're right about that, Sheriff. Our property borders the trail. Sheila here," he said, referring to me, "walks our little dog there. She just climbs through the square opening in the picket fence, while the little dog squeezes beneath. Awfully convenient, really." "That's right, sir," I said. "I take our miniature schnauzer for walks there, but I never see Mrs. Barok there. If you're wondering, I would have noticed, sir. Well, Mrs. Barok, she's always in your face. She's bright as a parrot, big, loud. Daddy calls her the parrot chicken, don't you, Daddy? Because she's so noisy, so bright." My father flushed bright pink and said nothing, but if looks could kill, he passed me a fleeting dagger look, as if to say, "Don't you dare make me look like a suspect in this missing case scenario, with a desire to do in Mrs. Barok, to calm down the excessively bright scenery and the obtrusive background noise." The last time I saw Mrs. Barok, Sheriff Carter, said my mother, intervening, was when she was being particularly rude to me about my chutney that I happened to enter in for the competition. I didn't take offence like most people would have done, because she's like that with everyone. She tells you exactly what she thinks, without that quintessential charcoal filter, so to speak, that cleanses away the nasty words before they begin to come out. Mrs. Barok has no filter, Sheriff. I would be surprised if she went on the Misty Hill Trail behind our home. That woman has never exercised a single day in her life. It's not a trail for the faint-hearted. It's actually quite steep. She would never venture down a trail like that, given her size, and of course her inadequate level of fitness, surely.
It would seem that is exactly what she did, said the sheriff. I gather she recently went to the doctor, according to Mr. Barok. Her blood work didn't come back good. The doctor encouraged her to start exercising forthwith.
Well, why would someone not fit attempt such a trail, piped my mother. It really doesn't make any sense at all, Sheriff. They're much more agreeable, flatter trails in these parts to attempt.
Well, according to her husband, she didn't want to be seen by the locals. She feels rather self-conscious about her weight. So her husband dropped her off at the trailhead. He came back to collect her. She was gone.
Wow, said my mother. Who would have thought Mrs. Barok would be self-conscious? She's the most confident person I know. Demure and reticent, she most certainly is not. By any chance, Sheriff, did the police check her hiking route after she had attempted it? Maybe she had a stroke. It wouldn't surprise me if that were indeed the case. I mean, without wishing to be rude, it's a bit like asking a sloth to enter a marathon. I'm not saying that to be unkind, you must understand, but if she has overexerted herself, she could have had a heart attack.
We've checked the hiking trail thoroughly. There are no signs of her anywhere.
Do you think she was murdered, Sheriff? I asked. I mean, she wasn't popular. Someone could have done her in. Lots of people don't like her.
I very much doubt she's been murdered, said the sheriff. Granted, she is a difficult woman, rubbing up people the wrong way all the time. She's not everybody's cup of tea. But I think murder is very unlikely. Of course, we can't rule anything out yet, but I am inclined to think she had an accident, or dare I say it, was attacked by a wild animal. I sincerely hope the latter is not the case.
But, Sheriff, do you think she's dead? I piped.
I hope not, but the longer she remains missing, the more we're forced to conclude that she may no longer be in life. I would like you, Sheila, to keep an eye out when you go hiking with your dog on that trail. Let me know if you see anything amiss or untoward. It can be anything. The littlest things can be very, very significant. Like a strip of material from Mrs. Barok's gymming clothes, clinging to a branch. It helps us to piece together what may have become of the poor woman. I would take some bear spray, though, if I was you, just to be safe, because you don't know what is hanging out in those woods.
Thanks, Sheriff, I said. I will. A week went by, and no one had seen sight or sound of Anna Barok. I will say that Jacques Barok didn't appear to be missing his wife very much, which only fueled speculation among the locals that he might have had something to do with his wife's mysterious disappearance. I just think that he was finally able to breathe after she was out of his way, as he had been suffocated by her for so long with her larger-than-life personality. He had almost become obsolete, lost in the background when she was around. Now people were beginning to notice him again as an individual in his own right, and not Mrs. Barok's accessory that accompanied her everywhere, rather like a toy dog in a purse. It was on a Thursday morning when I woke up earlier than usual. I glanced out of the window of our double-storey symmetrical home. I could see that there was a gentle breeze blowing, as the towering oak trees scattered around our property were swaying like graceful tall ladies under the vast expanse of the bleached sky. The sun had risen gently. The crisp, fragrant morning was basked in its first light, while the verdant lawn shimmered with a silvery dew. My little schnauzer began to whimper excitedly, his bright button eyes literally begging me for a walk. "All right, Frisky," I said. "We'll go for a walk. He responded by jumping up and down in delight, mounting my leg with his tail wagging furiously. Frisky knew the word walk as well as his own name. I might as well get up early, I thought. I'm awake now. I put on my gym pants, a cotton t-shirt and a pair of trainers. I hurried down the sweeping staircase, taking particular care to be as quiet as I possibly could, with Frisky running ahead of me, as there wasn't room enough for the boisterous enthusiasm that was coursing now through his smooth silken grey form. I glided through the open-plan living room, towards the kitchen that framed its furthest corner, behind the kitchen counters, towards the back door. I closed it carefully behind me. I could feel a cool air blowing vigorously against my face as I bounded towards the picket fence that fringed the edge of our property and the head of the hiking trail. I hurriedly climbed through the middle square, bending my body through it, while Frisky scampered beneath the lowest square, squeezing himself under it. We crossed a tiny little clearing, finally entering the hiking trail in the woodgrove. I loved it here. It was so private. Although it was accessible to the public, it was barely ever used. It was hard to believe that this was the last place where Mrs. Barok had been seen alive. I had been looking for any signs of her, but had not found any evidence that she had been here at all. Soon all thoughts of Mrs. Barok were expunged from my mind, as this intoxicating forest drew me into her loving arms, rather like a mother embracing her long-lost child. I was so enjoying this tranquil retreat, as a lone red fox darted past me, eyeing me ever so curiously, while Frisky released a couple of excited yaps upon seeing the sleek red creature with its magnificent full tail of puffed-up red hair. The forest was flooded with the cheerful tweets of the dawn chorus, as if welcoming the beginning of a brand new day with all the opportunities it presented. For the songbird, it might be how many grubs he pecked out of the ground this morning. And for the squirrel, how many acorns he collected for his winter storage. And as for every single human being on the planet, it might be where their path would take them today. Little did I know that mine was not going to be a standard run-of-the-mill day. On the contrary, it was a day that I would be unlikely to ever forget, as its indelible mark would be imprinted on my mind like a tattoo forever, never to be erased or ever forgotten. Frisky and I travelled down the winding path, through the towering tall Douglas fir trees that were liberally scattered throughout the woodgrove, towering into the sky like spectacular green giants. We trekked up the steep incline that was dotted with boulders, ferns, brush, moss, and flowering forest plants in pretty pinks, yellows, purples, and whites. All of a sudden Frisky ran up to a large bramble bush and began scratching at it, dragging something out from beneath its boughs. It was a hand, a human hand, that was beginning to look black, as the first stages of decomposition had set in. I was amazed. It was still intact. It hadn't been demolished by a lone scavenger. Perhaps the sharp brambles of the thorn bush had prevented that from happening, I thought. Someone was screaming loudly. How I wished they would shut up. The shrill soprano noise was deafening. I remember wondering who was making such an acute, raucous commotion, when I suddenly realised that it was me. I was the one that was screaming like a banshee. The sight of the gruesome, macabre, decomposing hand had rattled me more than I cared to realise. I was the one that had filled the forest with my high-pitched screams that reverberated, penetrating the forest like a powerful, blasting horn, waking everything up that was in earshot. In a trice, everything in the forest became hushed. The bird song subsided. It evaporated like a subtle, indefinite, ethereal smell that suddenly fades. Even the wind subsided, retreating from whence it came. I had never known the forest like this before. I was so startled I stopped screaming. Even Frisky was growling, as if she felt threatened by something that I was unable to discern. But I could sense the presence of something big, powerful, mighty. But what, I could not imagine. That was when I got the overwhelming feeling that I was being watched by a pair of unseen eyes. But I glanced around the forest, seeing nothing. It is a creepy, discomposing feeling when you sense that. It sends chills down your spine, as you feel in your gut that something is wrong. Very, very wrong. In a trice, barreling through the wood green like a rhino hurtling through the thicket, trampling down everything in its wake, from branches to fallen leaves, ferns, brush, was a colossal humanoid creature, bearing a slight resemblance to an ape that was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. My miniature schnauzer was so terrified she bolted through the woods, making her way back home as quickly as she could, sparing very little regard for her owner. Looking back, I think the creature had come thundering through the forest to see who it was that was screaming. I probably sounded like someone in trouble, as my screams were ear-piercingly loud, even though at the time I was not aware of them myself. Unwittingly, I had drawn attention to myself from a creature that I would as sooner have avoided, for this thing was intimidating, powerful, daunting. In its presence I felt tiny, inconspicuous, helpless, fragile, like a doll that just might break, for this creature dwarfed me by its gargantuan, monstrous size. It was female. It looked paternal, protective even towards me, with deep-set dark eyes, of a very human-like face. She scanned me curiously. It was as if she was concerned about my welfare, which really was quite extraordinary, I thought. I'd never seen a creature like this before. She was so human, only much bigger than the average man, taller, wider, fuller, and much more muscular, covered with long flowing brown hair, the colour of a black bear. She possessed a cone-shaped head, a very short neck, and large gargantuan shoulders. All of a sudden this outlandish creature stood still, standing like a silent statue, frozen in time. It was as if she was listening to the forest, rather like a dog with its ears perked up. She was behaving exactly like that, when they discern a noise that no one else can hear. The creature grabbed me. With her overlong arms she bustled me away, guiding me to behind a tree. I should have screamed out in terror, but I didn't. I knew she was being protective of me. I thought maybe a mountain lion was loitering around, but why would a creature of her power and stature be intimidated by such a creature? It must be something else, I wondered. But what? That was when I saw Mrs. Barok's only brother, Herman, entering the woods. He was a large, hefty, sizable man who, like his sister, carried the vast majority of his weight around his middle section. But he did not possess her world-famous skinny legs. His head was bald, framed by a thick hedge of black hair around its outer perimeters. His eyes were deep-set and mean, buried beneath layers and folds of fat. What was he doing here, I wondered? He was from Maine and New Hampshire, not our part of the world. I knew he rarely ever visited his sister here in the Pacific Northwest, and they weren't exactly on good speaking terms either. I remember Mrs. Barok described her only brother as a weasel. I hid behind a tree with this creature standing guard over me. I was so glad of her company, because Herman was a dubious character at the best of times. I remember I always thought of him as shifty. He had a large spade in his hands, along with a hunting rifle. He began to dig a hole that was deep, large enough for a dead body. He was heaving, sweating, breathing heavily as he dug, wiping away the sweat that was trickling down his brow. I think he thought that being up with the sparrows he would not be observed. Why had he not done this a long time ago, I thought. That was when it hit me like a brick to the head that Herman was responsible for Mrs. Barok's death. But why? He was the one guilty of her murder, but it did not make any sense to me at all. What did he have to gain over her death? There was a pile of dried timbers laid on top of each other under a large ponderosa pine at the edge of the woods. That was when I saw Herman removing these stacked branches, which were covering a long, vertical, lumpy object, draped in a blue material. Within seconds, the forest was hit with the most repugnant, revolting, repulsive, offensive, objectionable smell of death and decay. Indeed, it was so abhorrent I wanted to heave and vomit, but by some miraculous miracle I managed to keep it together. You never forget a loathsome smell like that. It stays with you forever. The creature next to me was having difficulty dealing with the smell. She was covering her nose with an expression of disgust on her face, all the while beckoning for me to remain very still, which was exceedingly difficult to accomplish in these odorous conditions. She kept pointing to Herman's rifle, and then to me. She imitated him shooting. I think she might have actually witnessed Herman kill his only sister. She was protecting me from him, worried that I would succumb to the same fate. I was grateful she was watching me. I felt safe in her charge. The smell was so bad that Herman began throwing up violently over the ground. He was retching, heaving, and almost shaking from the convulsions caused by spewing his guts. Once he finally managed to compose himself, he began to slide a long blue sleeping bag cover over the forest floor with a hole in the area where a handless arm was dangling out in the bag. I watched him drag the sleeping bag, kicking the corpse into the open hole, beginning to cover it with soil and then with fallen branches. Finally, Herman walked away from the forest. I heard an engine start up as he drove away. I've never been so relieved to see anyone leave the forest in all my life as I was to see him go. The anomalous humanoid creature was so terribly kind to me. She was way too emotionally intelligent to be an animal. She was so sharp, perceptive, discerning, and much cleverer than a lot of people I know. I could tell that by nature she was reserved, but regardless of her reticence, she escorted me to our picket fence to make sure that I was safely returned home. I ran into the house to tell my parents what I'd seen. I willfully admitted the part about the anomalous creature I encountered, partly to protect her from human scrutiny, and partly because I doubted I would be believed anyway. Before long, there was yellow crime scene tape over parts of the forest, while the body of Mrs. Barok was being dug up, removed by the police, transformed to the medical examiner, while an autopsy was performed on her. It was discovered that she had been hit with a hunting rifle in the lower abdomen. At first, Herman Barok denied intentionally killing his sister, making out he'd been squirrel hunting while his sister was exercising in the forest. He claimed that while he was shooting a squirrel, his gun ricocheted and hit her in the lower abdomen. He had panicked and buried her body under some fallen timber. It would seem that he began to have nightmares of her body being recovered too soon, so he returned to the scene of the crime to bury her more efficiently, as he came to the conclusion that if he buried her, she might never, ever be found. Sheriff Carter informed me that Mrs. Barok's brother had confessed to her murder in exchange for a life sentence instead of the death penalty. It turned out that Mrs. Barok's only mother was dying of cancer with weeks left to live. She was dividing her vast inheritance between her son and her daughter. In the event of either party's death, all the money would be left to the remaining surviving sibling. No prizes for guessing that Herman wanted to inherit every last penny, so eliminating his sister from the equation was a great idea as far as he was concerned. Mrs. Barok had actually phoned her brother as advised by her doctor to warn him about his genetic risks to heart disease that the blood tests had revealed, that potentially affected him as well. When he learnt about Mrs. Barok exercising on a remote hiking trail, he knew that this was the perfect opportunity to exterminate her. I now realise that the creature I encountered that day in the woods was a Bigfoot. I believe she was the only eyewitness to Mrs. Barok being murdered. When she realised he'd come into the woods again, she probably thought that my life was in danger and was determined to protect me. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.